Welcome back to Rewind of the Living Dead. I am Damon Martin.
And I'm Top Dollar.
Also known as Patrick Guerra.
Also known as Patrick Guerra, of course.
You actually do have the top dollar hair. I never even really thought about that.
So. I do. Yes, I do. We're definitely going to get into the style of this movie, Damon, because tonight we're talking about, I think, a legendary movie known as The Crow. Yes, released in 1994 with a budget of $23 million and a worldwide gross of $50 million, starring, of course, the late, great Brandon Lee, and directed by Alex Proyas, written by James O'Barr, who wrote the comic, and David Cho and John Shirley.
So The Crow is celebrating its 30th anniversary this year, which is a big part of the reason why we're doing this. And it's actually being re-released into theaters for a special two-night engagement on Wednesday, May 29th and Thursday, May 30th as part of a special series with Fangoria. And that was, and they also just released the physical copy on 4K, which I already purchased and rewatched. I have a real history with The Crow because when this came out in 1994, I was a teenager, and at this point, I was a very broody teenager. I was very much into the grunge rock scene. I was very much a Pearl Jam, Nirvana, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Candlebox Kid. I, kind of consider myself a bit of an outcast and dealt with that in school and things like this. And I don't even really remember how I first heard about The Crow, but I do remember, of course, the tragic story of Brandon Lee passing away and growing up as a martial arts fan as well on originally movies like The Karate Kid and eventually discovering Bruce Lee's films when I heard about Brandon Lee dying. And that was a big story in the MTV generation because he was a bit of a rock star because of his dad and because of the career he was putting together as an action star. So I remember there was so much talk about he died during filming, and then they eventually decided to go ahead and finish the film and release it, and it came out in 1994. So when this came out, I was like, I have to see this. I had to see it. And I was still, I was still very much a kid at the time, but I made my parents take me to go see The Crow in 1994 in the movie theater. So I was actually one of the lucky people who actually saw this movie in the movie theater in 1994. And I would wager to say The Crow has been one of the most influential films of my entire life for a myriad of reasons, not the least of which what you're talking about with the style. Because while I've never been a full-on goth kid, I kind of quietly wanted to be the goth kid. I do dress in all black. I don't really consider myself goth, but I definitely dress in all black the majority of the time. I am covered in tattoos, and this movie, I think, at least played some small part in that little nugget getting, ingrained in my head and then carrying it forward for pretty much the rest of my life. So I've had a very close relationship with this movie since it came out in 1994. But I know that's vastly almost the exact opposite for you.
I have such a different history with this, and I'm going to open up by saying the first time I saw this movie was 2 days prior to this recording. I have not seen this movie in its entire 30-year lifespan. And for a very specific reason, Damon. When I was about 13 or 14 years old, the legend of this came out. Now, you and I growing up as kids born in the late 70s and 80s, Bruce Lee was nothing short of a mythic figure. Like nothing short of just Bruce Lee was beyond legend. He was someone who could kill somebody with one punch. I mean, that's literally how people talked about Bruce Lee. And I grew up knowing very famously like that he died and under mysterious circumstances. And when his son was killed on the set of this movie, The Crow, and I was a kid who watched every behind the scenes, every Entertainment Tonight, a little special on a making of a movie. I soaked all this stuff up like a sponge. And I even watched the expose on what went wrong and how Brandon Lee got killed in the making of this movie. Something in me said, I can't watch this. And I actually thought I was kind of alone in this. Like something about, I was like, I guess I'm just the one weirdo who's like, I can't watch it because something about it feels cursed to me. And then I go through today before this recording, I'm going through Instagram and I'm looking at all these many different horror outlets that you and I both follow, and they're all promoting the fact that The Crow is coming out. By the way, we're not officially sponsored. We're just letting you know that it's out on 4K. I wish somebody was sponsoring us to talk about The Crow. Genuinely, I wish somebody was sponsoring us. They're not. But everybody's talking about it on these Instagram posts, and I'm looking in the comments. I want to see how people are reacting. 90 to 95% of people were just like, this is the fucking raddest movie of all time. I fucking love The Crow. I've known for years that people just adore this movie. And there was that little 10 to 5% that said, I can't watch this movie because it's cursed. And for the first time in my entire life, Damon, since this movie came out, I didn't feel alone. There were other people who were like, yeah, I don't watch it. I'm not going to watch The Crow because Brandon Lee died. Now, of course, at some point you just have to go, okay, there's no superstition behind this. I can watch this movie. They made it. So I just kind of left all that to the side because, you know, you brought this up and I know how important this movie is to you. I'm really glad that I finally lifted my edict and watched The Crow. It is something very, very, very special, but also what makes it interesting and unique because of our perspectives, you growing up knowing and loving every inch of this movie and worshiping this movie, and I get it. I'm the opposite. I don't have any nostalgia for this movie. So I'm seeing it from a different viewpoint. I can see all of its strengths, but I can also see some weaknesses in there, which you'll probably vehemently disagree with, which is totally fine. But I don't have the nostalgia to paint it. But I am still a kid of that era. And what struck me right away, I'll just get straight into it. You know, I don't know if you want to talk about the plot first before we get into the things that we like and don't like about this movie. But the plot, I think, is actually kind of unique. And you, growing up being a comic book guy, maybe you should talk a little bit about the plot because it does stem from these comic books.
Yeah, so the original comic and the movie do differ in some ways. I'm not going to get too deep into that. The concept is fairly the same though. In the movie, a young couple, Eric Draven and Shelley Webster, live in an apartment building, kind of in a rundown neighborhood. They never say the town they're in, but you know, Devil's Night's very famously in Detroit, so that's always kind of where I took it was homaged from.
Yeah.
And one night on Devil's Night, when people are out wreaking mayhem, setting fires to the town, these thugs break into a building where Shelley Webster had filed a complaint about them being evicted. There was somebody trying to clear the building and they were fighting their eviction. And they come into the house and they attack. And I don't want to, you can't sugarcoat this. They attack, beat, and rape Shelley Webster. And when her boyfriend, Eric Draven, who is a rocker in a band called Hangman's Joke, shows up, they shoot him and toss him out a window. And he dies, and then she eventually dies 30 hours later. And then a year later, a crow shows up on Eric Draven's gravesite, and it's an old myth that, the crow carries the soul of the body, your soul across to the other world, to the other region, whatever you believe that is. And the crow comes back and says, basically, we're not going to let you travel because there's unfinished business here. And so Eric Draven is resurrected for the exact specific reason of exacting revenge on the people who killed him and his fiance. And that is basically the rest of the movie is Eric Draven as the Crow eliminating every single person who had anything to do with his death and with the death of his fiance, Shelley Webster. And the original comic isn't that much different. The original comic is Eric Draven and Shelley have their car breakdown and they get attacked by a group of thugs. And in that story, Tintin, or not Tintin, excuse me, who am I thinking of? Why am I not thinking of the name? I'm getting all the characters' names mixed up all with T-Bird. Excuse me, T-Bird is the main bad guy. Top Dollar is just a member of his gang in the comic book, and the same kind of thing happens. They attack and kill Shelley and do all the awful things, and then, Eric Draven comes back and exacts revenge on the gang. It's a slightly different plot, but the same spirit is there, and this time they transform Top Dollar, played by Michael Wincott, into the big bad, whereas T-Bird is just the leader of the gang who carries out his orders. So really, it's not a huge difference. And James O'Barr, the creator, was involved in the creative process. with the Crow movie as well, because the comic only came out a few years earlier. I think it came out in 1989, and then the movie came out in 1994. So it's not a huge difference between one to the other. So that's the plot of the movie. It's a revenge film, and it's been well documented on this show, Patrick. I love revenge films. That's probably one of my favorite genre of film in general, not even to do with horror. So it's kind of like dipping into every world. And also, this is based on a comic, which I was a huge comic book fan growing up. And this does teeter the line. Is it horror? I don't know. I mean, it teeters. It's definitely a horrific story, and far more horrific than anything you'd ever see in a comic book movie, which we'll talk about a little later. So I think it does teeter that line. So it was a blend of everything. It was a comic book movie. It was kind of a horror movie. It was a sci-fi thriller, and it was a revenge thriller. So it spoke to me on every level possible.
Yeah, I mean, I watched it and I immediately got like Matrix vibes. And that should be no surprise to anybody who's a film nut because Alex Proyas directed another movie called Dark City, which many will argue is almost a complete Matrix completely rips Dark City. And Alex Proyas is a music video director and he's directed a lot of stuff, but I think The Crow was his second film, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe so.
Yeah, but just that aesthetic of this dark city and people clad in leather and spikes and driving, crummy cars, and it's always raining and their hair is always greasy. There was just something about that aesthetic that felt so warm and cozy for me, Damon. It was just like, oh my God, this is perfect. Like, of course, I love the aesthetic of this world. Right away, too, something that like struck me was like, movies used to have scale. Movies used to feel really big. Now I'm not being an old fart and say movies don't feel big anymore. Like certain action movies feel huge, certain Marvel movies can feel huge, but a lot of them are shot on like sound stages and volumes. So like you still know that you're kind of just sitting in a room with a screen. And I know this was shot on set in North Carolina, but there's something about they wanted it to feel huge. They wanted this city to feel really lived in. It felt like the grimy streets of Detroit. It really did. I love that. Like I don't want to say it's a lost art, but something about these aesthetics don't feel the same anymore. Also, they're playing on a cheat code anyway because they're shooting on an older film stock that literally doesn't exist anymore. There are no. I don't know what film stock they shot on. I could look it up, but that's just the geek in me going, look at that old film stock and how it creates a certain quality of the image that you just can't replicate anymore. Like I've seen movies that were shot on film and new movies that are shot on film, they don't have that same texture to them that these older movies do. So there's tons of nostalgia that comes back to me, even though I never watched this movie ever. It was just like, yeah, I'm right there with you. I was way into grunge. I was way into like long hair. I always wanted long hair. Like my dad did not want me to have long hair ever. And now I just live with long hair. So take that, Dad. But this like, if 13 or 14-year-old Patrick had seen this movie, I would have been like, this is my whole personality. If everybody can understand, The Crow is like what I want out of life. It's dark, it's dank. The music's great. That you played that song from the Cure when it started playing, I was like, fuck yeah, dude, hell yes. Like this is just what every goth and goth adjacent person on this planet, and I know tons of horror people that adore this movie, this is just what we want injected in our veins every single day.
When you saw this film, and I already hear it in your voice, so I know the answer, but I want to hear you talk about it. When you saw it, because again, in a weird way, I'm glad you didn't see it because my perspective is such a perspective adoration. This is such an influential film for me in so many ways. I mean, I wish I could pan the camera over to my left. I have like basically a Crow section of my house where it's like poster, toys, vinyl records. Like I collect. I'm a massive Crow fan. So like for me, and I have t-shirts, the whole deal. For me, it is one of the most influential films of my entire lifetime. And in a weird way, I'm glad you didn't because you're not attached to it the same way. Now, from what I can gather, you enjoyed the film, and you said there's some issues you'll take with it, and that's fine. I understand that. And again, in a weird way, I'm glad because I'll fully admit it's hard for me to take a step back and look at this film through non-rose colored glasses because this is such an influential film for me. And when I rewatched it a couple nights ago, and I've seen this film 100 times, but I rewatched it the other night, the 4K transfer, and it was like taking me back to when I was a kid. You know, it was like being in that movie theater, watching it for the first time ever in 1994. And it just washed over me all, again, the emotions of how much I loved this movie and how much it influenced me. And the soundtrack, which I stood in line when they released the vinyl soundtrack of this for the first time like 5 years ago. I stood in line for Record Store Day for like 4 hours. I got the last copy at my record store. Now it's out everywhere. You can buy it on vinyl everywhere you go. But at the time, they had never released it. And I was like, I'm standing in line all night if I need to buy this soundtrack on vinyl. But I'm glad you haven't. But I'm curious, now that you've seen it, and this came out in 1994, and I read an interview with Alex Proyas more recently, I want to say 2021 or 2023, I can't remember the year, and he was talking about the influence that The Crow had on even Dark City, which was his next film, which is actually a really good film. I like the film. Yeah. Kiefer Sutherland, great film. But he talked about how much The Crow, the style, the shooting, the soundtrack, how much it influenced future films. He mentioned The Matrix, he mentioned Blade, he mentioned a lot of films that came after that kind of adapted that gothic, dirty, grimy style that he really, I won't say he invented it, I'm sure there's other examples out there, but he really perfected it in 1994. When you watched it for the first time, did you watch this and go, oh wow, like a lot of people, I won't say ripped off, that's the wrong word, a lot of people borrowed from The Crow.
Yeah, you feel the influence, definitely. But it also was a movie of its time. Like there are movies of that exact era, like the early 90s, that I go, oh yeah, it's very much in this style, you know, for better and for worse. But yeah, I could just see all over it. I mean, I've known Dark City and I've watched Dark City. So for me, I was always primed like, oh wow, The Matrix really ripped off Dark City. And then there's like an aspect of The Crow in The Matrix as well. But I still tie The Matrix in my mind more to Dark City than I would The Crow. But just like there was little things like I didn't realize this is where Bai Ling became a big name. Like Bai Ling didn't show up again until there was another movie that they made a huge deal out of Bai Ling showing up. What was it? I'm looking it up right now. Oh gosh, I don't know what it was. Anyway, you know, like it was things like that. It was like seeing certain actors and there's tons of great character actors. By the way, how about this, Damon? As a huge fan of Ghostbusters, Ernie Hudson's in this movie. I had no fucking clue that Ernie Hudson is not just in this movie. He's essentially the co-star of this movie. He's very critical to the plot. Tony fucking Todd is in this movie playing Grange, one of the I don't know if you call him henchmen. He was sort of just like the maitre d' to Top Dollar, our Michael Wincott character. It's shit like that where I was just like, oh hell yeah, like everybody's in this movie. I love it.
This movie, so I wanted to mention this anyways because we're eventually going to get to best performance later in categories, but I wanted to mention how like prolific this cast is because you got to remember, and also you mentioned the budget of $23 million. I want to put that in context. The budget for this film was $15 million.
Yeah.
The extra $8 million came in when they had to do reshoots after Brandon Lee's tragic death, and they had to do reshoots and do the digital imaging. And really the film was basically done. It was in the final few days of shooting when Brandon tragically passed. But when they came back and finished this a few months later, that was the extra $8 million to do reshoots and get the film done. So this is on a $15 million budget. So this really isn't like a super expensive film by any stretch of the imagination. But when you think about the cast that's in this thing, I mean, and again, I know not everyone in this cast went on to become massive stars, but when you think about how many people are in this movie and how good they are. You mentioned Ernie Hudson, of course, great character actor. Everyone knows from the Ghostbusters. Michael Wincott, who played Top Dollar. I'll get into him more later, but I'll say that this is a guy who I feel like watching this movie in 1994, I'm like, oh wow, this is going to be a guy I'm going to spend the rest of my life watching because he's so good in this movie. Bai Ling is still around, like she still does things to this day. David Patrick Kelly, who is one of my favorite character actors of all time. 48 Hours. He's in Twin Peaks, The Hoarders. He is so good, and he is so great in this movie as T-Bird. Lawrence Mason is Tintin. He's in a lot of things. He's in Twister. Have you ever watched Twister? He's in that movie.
He's in another 90s staple, Hackers.
Hackers, yeah.
Oh my God, dude. I mean, you're talk about a movie that's also feels a lot like The Crow, but it's, very grounded. He's in Hackers. So right away when I saw him, I was like, oh shit, he's from Hackers, dude. And Hackers takes me fully back to the 90s. I absolutely love that movie.
A Matthew Lillard classic right there to go along with
That's
his
right.
career. And then, of course, you mentioned Tony Todd, who's in this, who, again, that was, the Candyman right around that time. Michael Massey, who I will talk about more later, who played Fun Boy. He became a, very great character actor in his own right. He was in Seven. He also appeared in the first season as a great villain in the first season of 24. And then one of my favorite character actors of all time who is in this movie is John Polito, who plays Gideon, the pawn shop owner,
Yeah.
who became a very famous staple of the Coen brothers movies. Everyone remembers him from The Big Lebowski and other, but he became a staple of those movies. And John Polito is one of those guys when you see, he's very much a that guy. You see him like, hey, I know that guy. He was in an episode of Seinfeld. He passed away a couple of years ago, but he was so great. Everything he was in, he popped up in. You're like, that was great. But that was the first time I'd ever seen him was as Gideon. He's so great as Gideon, the pawn shop owner in this movie. Top to bottom, this movie is casted incredibly well for, again, what at the time was just kind of a lower budget comic book adaptation at a time. And I want to talk about this anyways, Patrick. In 1994, there was no Marvel. There was no DC. There was no Image. Nobody was investing in comic book movies in 1994. We did not grow up in an era where your kids do today, where you can flip on the channel anytime of the day. And there's probably going to be Iron Man, Avengers, something's going to be showing, the new Superman movie, the new Batman movie, something's going to be on TV, and you're going to see, I could go out to my TV right now. I have YouTube TV. I could go out to YouTube TV right now, and I guarantee you, I wouldn't have to flip more than 20 channels and I'd run into a comic book movie. That was not the case when we were kids.
No, not at all. Damon, we grew up obviously on the Christopher Reeve Superman, I think is the comic book movie that everybody knew. And it was very much like a worldwide phenomenon. It was Superman, the Richard Donner movie, fantastic. Then there was also Batman, which was like, again, unheard of. It was just sort of this weird outlier. It was like, well, there are the Batman movies, but that was kind of it. And there was, by the way, I grew up on Swamp Thing. So you want to talk about like comic book movies? Swamp Thing and Return of the Swamp Thing are probably my two favorite fucking comic book movies, truth be told. I love those. But that's all you were getting. You weren't getting just this and this movie and that movie left and right that were comic book based. And this one, even is, like you're saying, it's not like it was the most popular comic in the world. Somebody saw the potential in this to make a great movie, and it has all the trappings of a great movie. And I think down the line in this episode, we're going to talk about what that actually is going to mean, because there's another movie coming, Damon. We didn't just talk about The Crow for our health, and because it's coming out on Blu-ray and no one's paying us to say that. There's it's relevant for today.
Absolutely. And also to mention that, and it is the 30th anniversary this year. That's also, it was released May 13, 1994. So it is technically the anniversary. But yeah, the comic book movies, you mentioned Superman. That was when I was a kid. I love Swamp Thing, by the way. Of course, Wes Craven, iconic, and Adrienne Barbeau, one of my favorite scream queens of all time. Batman was the other one, and then Batman and the Batman Returns, which were both Tim Burton movies, and we all know Tim Burton is very much the goth kid. We just dropped the trailer for Beetlejuice, which I may be the one person on earth who's not really excited about that movie because I'm not a Tim Burton fan. I don't mind Tim Burton. Tim Burton is like he's the Tarantino for you, like where everyone else loves him and you're kind of like, eh. That's me with Tim Burton. I'm like, all right.
Right.
I love
he's hit and miss.
I love the 89 Batman, but everyone's like, oh my God, Edward Scissorhands is just this genius. I'm like, whatever. Anyway, sorry, not to get all too far off subject, but Tim Burton was the other kind of gothic director of that time. And Batman Returns, which came out in 89 and 92, those were both very big films, but that was kind of it. Now, the biggest difference with The Crow, while it is based on a comic book, this is when you say comic book movie, quote unquote, this is in line with A History of Violence, which is a comic book movie, great movie, super violent. It's in that realm where it is based on a comic book, but it is not what you would typically think of as a comic movie. This is a very violent, of course, we all know I mentioned earlier the words people don't like to talk about was sexual assault and things like this in this movie. But and again, I will say this: generally speaking, I hate when that is used as a tool like flippantly in movies. I feel like it does get flippantly used. This one, it makes sense. This one, you know why it happens, and I mean, sadly, you would expect it almost to happen with the horrific atrocities carried out upon this couple by these thugs. But this is such a dark film. And also, let's be honest, Patrick, this is a very violent film. Like, they do not pull punches with the deaths in this film. They do not pull punches with the blood in this film. This is a very violent film. So while we do have a lead character with the makeup and the trench coat and the all black attire and the combat boots, the full on goth, like every goth kid from 1994 on dressed like the Crow.
Oh yeah.
This was not a film that you would say, "Oh yeah, this is a great comic book movie," because they didn't make them back then. And let's be honest, they're not really making this today either. Like, they're not looking for these really dark, dour stories. Even The Sandman, which became kind of a hit on Netflix, which I'm still kind of shocked they got made that to this day. Even that took forever to get made because people couldn't figure out how to do it. It was so dark, it was violent, all these different things. These kind of stories didn't get made in 1994, and Patrick, 30 years later, they're still not really being made in 2024.
Yeah, and that kind of shifts to the other genres that I think The Crow it really embraces even way more than the comic book genre is the genre of revenge, which is it's no new genre. It's actually a very old genre, but it really, in my opinion, peaked in the late 70s and the 80s with fantastic revenge films that you and I just grew up on. Charles Bronson movies. There was a lot of the Chuck Norris movies. Commando's a revenge movie, truth be told. I love Commando. That's a revenge
Rolling Thunder.
movie.
You've seen Rolling Thunder, right? Rolling Thunder, classic.
By title, I might not know what that is.
William Devane is in it. It's from the 70s. It's an old school revenge thriller. It's a great one. If you haven't seen it, check it out. I think it's actually, I want to say it's actually on Tubi right now, if I'm not mistaken. Tubi or Amazon. I saw it pop up recently. I was like, hey, Rolling Thunder's on there. So if you haven't seen Rolling Thunder, it's a great revenge film.
I'm sure. Yeah. I mean, I for some reason that one isn't sparking my brain, but revenge is all over this movie. And that's what I noticed about halfway through. I was like, oh, I'm just in a solid revenge movie. And revenge movies are actually very simple. They start with usually a violent crime of some sort, a kidnapping or a break-in, an assault, a murder, and then someone seeks justice. The difference is we get a supernatural twist on that, which is this guy who is basically plucked from death by the Crow and is given his marching orders, like your soul cannot rest until you make this right, that's the theme of any standard revenge movie. Charles Bronson's soul could not be at rest until he mowed down these guys. Like, that's what he had to do. So I immediately resonated with at least the basic story of The Crow, because I was like, oh, this is a flat out revenge film. It really is. Just with this goth twist, with this twist that this guy could heal himself. You know what I mean? Like, right away when the Crow leads him back to the scene of the crime, and he's literally a tortured soul. It's actually, there's a little subgenre in here which is artsy fartsy, Damon, which I was like, haha, Damon loves this movie. It's super artsy fartsy. But he leads him back in the throes of agony to the scene of the crime, and he's throwing himself all around the room in agony, and he grabs onto the glass and it cuts his hands, and he looks at his hands and they heal. They don't mention why, they don't mention how, but he just goes, cool. Now, like, he realizes, I can't be killed. That's awesome, because what I need to do now is lay down some good old fashioned justice. And he does it, Damon, in very dramatic and artsy fartsy fashion. I'm surprised here, because Damon is vehemently anti-art film, yet he's a David Lynch fan, which there's no bigger art goon than David Lynch on the planet. And he loves The Crow, which is totally an artsy fartsy film.
It is. I'll fully admit that. And this falls in that David Lynch category of I can't totally explain why, but I do love it. But I will say what also makes a great revenge film, Because you can make a revenge film very simply, as you said. An atrocity gets carried out of any sort. It's how that revenge is exacted that represents whether or not your film works. Mm-hmm. Kill Bill works because the way that Quentin Tarantino exacted revenge for the bride, for Beatrix Kiddo, and then the characters that she has to assassinate, from Lucy Liu's character to Michael Madsen's character all the way to David Carradine, that adds elements of why the revenge works so well. Because you can't just have these nameless, faceless goons that do nothing and you're just killing them, because that doesn't work. There's no passion there. There's no interest there. It's just, oh yeah, I'm just avenging these nameless, faceless killers, these nameless, faceless assassins, these assailants. You need to have them have something to grab onto to make it special when you get that revenge. Kill Bill, I'm not saying Tarantino followed the Crow playbook, but I feel like Tarantino followed the Crow playbook, because when you look at the characters that the bride goes after, you can relate them sort of back to the characters in Top Dollar, all the way down to Tintin and all the way down to T-Bird. These characters all have a bit of an interesting twist to them. You know, T-Bird is kind of the charismatic, grungy leader of the group. Tintin's this kind of badass dude with the dreads and the knives and very cool, dress, very cool look to him. Skank is a bit of the dumbass, but like the kind of, the guy who will literally walk into a fire for no reason. Yeah. And then you got Fun Boy, who's kind of a dorky, almost like an outspoken, the pervy guy that you kind of see. And they all have this, and then you get to Top Dollar, who has this incredibly cold, just evil demeanor to him.
He's almost like a vampire.
Yeah. When Eric Draven reaches out and starts killing these people and getting his revenge, it all works because these characters all have personality. They all have something to latch onto. Some of the coolest moments are those moments, like when Tintin, when he's going after Tintin, he says, he knocks Eric Draven down. He distracts him by, basically insulting him and Shelley, and distracts him for a minute. He goes, murder? Let me tell you about murder. It's easy. It's fun. You're going to learn all about it. Just little things like that dialogue. You're like, yes, like it's like this, just like you grab onto that dialogue. And then when he gets him back, of course, it's brilliant. Same thing with T-Bird. He ties him into the car, and he says, I knew you. There ain't no coming back. There ain't no coming back. Little things like that, little personality quirks that you meet about these people make the revenge feel that much more real and more lived in. And I think that's what separates The Crow as a revenge thriller, on par with movies like Kill Bill, like movies, I'm trying to think of other great revenge thrillers. Why am I drawing a blank here? But movies of that ilk that have a great lead character, and then the revenge goes against characters that you hate, but you also, in a weird way, kind of like a little bit. Like, what happens to the bride in Kill Bill is awful, but when you hear Bill read that speech about Clark Kent and Superman, that's an iconic speech. Everyone knows that speech. Everyone loves that speech. It's one of Tarantino's best dialogues ever, when he talks about how Superman is, his real hidden persona is Clark Kent. That's his secret identity, not Superman. Superman's who he is. That whole speech is great, and you kind of like Bill. Like, you're kind of like, I kind of like this guy.
Charismatic, yeah.
You know that T-Bird and Tintin, all these guys are scumbag criminals, and you certainly don't feel bad when they die, but you they got personalities. And as Tarantino says in Pulp Fiction, personality goes a long way. So giving them something to grab onto, and not just making these one-note characters of just, I'm a bad guy, that doesn't do anything for you. You need, when you go to Blade, you need Stephen Dorff to play the opposite of Wesley Snipes. You need David Carradine and Michael Madsen to play the opposite of Uma Thurman. That's, I think, what The Crow does so well.
Yeah, it really does. And it's interesting you bring up Tarantino, because I wouldn't say that Tarantino pulled from The Crow. In fact, I don't know if Tarantino's ever said anything about The Crow that you know of.
Not that I'm aware of anyway.
But I would bet you cash money he hates it, because he pretty much hates everything that happened after the 1970s. He thinks all the 80s is trash. He really does. He loves the 1970s and back. But what The Crow and Tarantino do is they make colorful bad guys. Really, like the old westerns, every bad guy was distinctive. They were a silhouette. There was something about them that stood out. Every henchman stood out. They weren't just a bunch of blank henchmen. They all had something to them. One might hold a whip. One might have a big scar across their eye. This is just classic henchman shit. So when this crew attacks this Eric and Sarah, they're
Shelley.
purely sadistic. Sorry,
Shelley's the girlfriend.
sorry, Shelley. Excuse me. They're purely sadistic. And when I took my notes, I go, these guys are pure psychopaths. Good. Like they are absolutely unhinged crazy men. So you don't feel bad about going after them, but it does have that color that really does come from the 50s, 60s, and 70s revenge stuff and action and cowboy stuff from way back when. I think Tarantino and Proyas, and I want to spotlight the writers real quick. David Show, who you might know, wrote a movie that you and I both actually really like, Texas Chainsaw: The Beginning. He wrote that movie. I mean, that's my favorite of the remakes. He also wrote Critters 3, if you're down with that. And John Shirley, he also wrote The Specialist, which is another great like 90s erotic thriller, which we talked a little bit about when we were talking about Love Lies Bleeding. So these guys really came up on that stuff, and it shows in this movie. This gang, growing up, all the 80s, 70s, and 80s movies I watched, the gangs were cool. I hate to admit that. I hate to admit that out loud, but like as a little kid, I was like, yeah, I want to wear a fucking bandana around my head and a leather jacket with spikes on it. And I want to have a knife and I want to have leather and I want to like be hanging out of a car window and throwing bottles at cop cars. Like, it looks fucking cool. Like yes, these guys are sadistic, but also they look cool. Like there was something about not trying to portray them. I think we have a problem now with bad guys where we have to make them sympathetic now. These guys weren't sympathetic. They were absolute outlaws. And something is sexy about outlaws. They just are. I know you and I are kind of obsessed with outlaw biker culture. Neither of us ride motorcycles, but I think both of us are just like, yeah, I know those guys were running meth and shooting Mongols, but they look fucking cool. Like, I don't know how to explain. I don't know how to like rectify that in my brain, but that's how it works.
It's like Kiefer Sutherland in Lost Boys. Like, he's a bad
100%.
guy, but like when you look at David in Lost Boys, you're like, I want to be that fucking guy. I want to
be one of the Lost Boys. You shouldn't want to be one of the Lost Boys. They're killers. Yeah. But you can't help but be mesmerized by them, and very much this gang here. What's the name of the gang? You would know.
They don't really have it.
I thought they had a name.
They call it T-Bird's crew. They just call it
T-Bird's crew or whatever. Yeah, but you're just like, yeah, these guys are fucking assholes. But man, I at least want to dress like them. Like by minimum, I want to dress like these guys.
Well, and you mentioned that, and I don't want to get too far off subject. I have a theory about why nowadays it seems like they try to make every villain sympathetic, and that is how they try to add in personality to the villains of today's culture. I think part of it stems from the explosion starting with Tony Soprano of the anti-hero. I think the fact that you can paint Tony Soprano and Walter White as lead characters that everyone loves, yet they are carrying out horrific atrocities on basically an episode-to-episode basis, yet the audience roots for them. I think that's kind of permeated into our villain culture, where now it's like, well, hold on now. Our villain is a villain, but he has a tragic backstory, or he has this going on. I think that's part of where it came from, was the anti-hero, with Dexter. I mean, Dexter was a huge character. Dexter's a serial killer, but everyone rooted for Dexter. Everyone loved Dexter. Yeah. No one really thought, oh, well, he's actually killing people, every week on the show. And, right. It's taking out, vigilante justice, but because he's killing bad guys, we're okay with it. I think that's part of where it's come from, because that got so popularized in TV and then eventually into films that I feel like that's where we're at now, where every writer, or at least most writers, I won't say every writer, most writers look at their villains and say, well, you know what? I could write him in a way that the audience might actually kind of like him and kind of care about him. Tintin, T-Bird, Funboy, and Skank, they're all awful, awful people. There is not a redeemable quality amongst them. But when they get together and they shoot the ammunition, when they put the ammunition, they do shots and they do that, the whole fire it up. Just they have these personalities that you're kind of like that, they're kind of, you're not rooting for them by any stretch of the imagination, and you're certainly not feeling bad for them when they die, but they do have that charisma about them, that swagger about them, where you're kind of like, yeah, I kind of dig the way he dresses, or that line when I talked about, he says, murder, let me tell you about murder. Those little things you can repeat the lines, you can kind of feel, but you don't feel bad about it. And I think that's what separates The Crow from today's movie, because I feel like that heroism is kind of infected villains of today's cinema.
And what I think is, I'm starting to put together in my head here, is that what modern villains have is that they are the good guys of their own story. Even if they're doing something bad, and even if what they do is like objectively bad, in their minds they're doing the right thing. The villains in The Crow are not doing the right thing. They are literally just only doing the wrong thing, and there's no way you could flip it around and go, well, in my mind, I'm being the good guy of this story. They're not. They're being psychopaths. So all they have is their charisma. If without that, they are literally just like, I don't know, monsters, ghouls. You know what I mean? There's nothing else about them. So it's almost of the time. It's almost of the 90s, or again, of the influence, what I believe is from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which is these aren't the good guys of their own story. They know they're the bad guys of their story. They're purely psychopathic. So the only thing you can give them is charisma. The only thing you can give them is cool clothing, cool looks, cool things to say, because all they really are is bad. Even, okay, Heath Ledger's Joker might be the apex point, right? Where these things collided, where he believed he was the good guy of his story, even though he was a pure psychopath, but he looked cool. He said cool shit. He did cool shit. Everybody kind of wants to be Heath Ledger's Joker, but you can't justify what he's doing. It's purely psychopathic. It was almost like the bridge was gapped right there, or the gap was bridged right there, rather. But these characters, no, they have no internal moral high ground of any sort. So you have to give them that charisma, and that is very much a product of that time. And then you talk about Top Dollar. Now I'll give you one of the problems I have with this movie. Top Dollar, for all his charisma, and you talk about anybody I wanted to be in this movie, all I wanted to be was Top Dollar and Micah in that room doing God knows fucking what. I don't even know what the fuck they were doing in that room. He's this very charismatic. I mean, like I called him like Lestat when I first saw him. I was like, oh look, he looks like a vampire. Like he genuinely looks like a vampire, because it's iron straight hair and the very fancy clothing and the long nails and all this shit. And he was just like a really heightened villain. I was like, cool. However, and this is one of my criticisms, I had no idea why he was the main villain. Like, I think he had something to do with the real estate situation, right? I mean, that's the best I could surmise. But really, he felt almost like an observer. He was just sort of there. His gang was off doing everything, making everything happen. And as they were being picked off, he was just sort of there, like stroking his hair or Bai Ling's hair or something, and just going, well, isn't that interesting? Well, isn't that funny? Like, he just sort of sat in his room and pontificated. And I was like, that's kind of weird for such a cool character, by the way. And of course, they do pay him off because he has his wall of swords, and Bai Ling figures out, oh, what if we grab his crow? And, it's all very like of the times, where I think now you'd be way more sophisticated in how you made those characters work. But at the time, I was like, they really are just sitting in that room, not looking very cool, but not doing much of anything.
I won't disagree with you totally, because because you're not exactly wrong with that. And ultimately, he was just a crime boss. I mean, that's really all he was. And again,
Yeah.
you just have to surmise that yes, he's sweeping and clearing these buildings because he's going to tear them down. He's going to sell them. He's going to gentrify them. Whatever the case may be, at what he's doing, he's just a bad guy doing bad things. And I think the extension of that being T-Bird and his crew are just going in and burning down these buildings and throwing people out and attacking and doing atrocities carried out in his name, and you find out that he's the one pulling the strings. So yeah, he is a bit of a kind of an odd character in that way, because you never totally know. Even when he has that big meeting of the big villains, when he's just like, we don't, we're not gonna, we want to set a fire so big that the gods notice us again, because Devil's Night is like, he's like, what do we have now? Devil's Night greeting cards. He kind of lays it out to the other crime bosses. He's just a crime boss. But I think the reason why it works in this film, for me, is because, same thing we talked about with T-Bird and Tintin and all those characters, he's a cool motherfucker. And it's like,
cool.
that almost redeems it for you're kind of like, what is he doing? Like, what is his purpose here? He's just a bad guy doing bad things. And because they make him, like, even in that moment when T-Bird comes in and he's getting ready to crew up for the next night to sell the fires, he says, one of my crew got himself perished, which is one of my favorite lines. And he's sitting there cutting the cocaine with his razor blade, and he goes, let's have a moment of introspection for poor old Tintin. And Snipsy's like, anyone want to tell me about what happened to Gideon's? He's like, is that a natural disaster or act of God? Call it my need to know. Like, you can just tell this guy has his fingers in everything. Like, nothing happens in this city without him having some knowledge of it. And it's just, and I think, to your point, the one thing I'll say that I bump up against slightly with the T-Bird thing, where the crew gets picked off and he just doesn't seem to give a shit. The reason why I think that is because he's so powerful, he's so ingrained. The way I took it, and this is maybe this is my interpretation, when I see him sit down with that giant crew of criminal bosses and bad guys, and Skank has that line, which, not to ruin my best line later, when he's like, Skank, he's like, what's your name, Skank? What do you feel about that? And he's like, I feel like a little worm on a big fucking hook. Tintin, T-Bird, Funboy, and Skank, they're just one part of a little, like, he doesn't give a shit about these guys. He doesn't care. They're just carrying out his business.
Oh, yeah,
he doesn't care about them. So when they get picked off, he doesn't give a shit. The only thing he cares about is that somebody's going against his business and he didn't allow it. That's all he cares about. So when you talk about, like, they start getting picked off and he just doesn't give a shit, he doesn't give a shit, because he'll replace Tintin with the next Tintin 10 minutes later. He'll replace T-Bird with the next. So that's kind of where I bump up against that, because you can kind of tell, like, he doesn't care. Just like when Gideon shows up in his room and he tells him what happens and he's mouthing off a little bit, which I love John Polito's portrayal of Gideon, because he's like, I'm not twisted like you two sick fucks. Like, even in the moment when he's scared out of his mind, he's still talking shit, and then he stabs him to the neck. That's just this guy's demeanor. He doesn't give a shit. Like, he pulls the strings, and if you dare mess with him, he'll clip your strings. And so that's kind of the way I took him. Even though you're right, you are right about him being a bit of a weird villain where you're not really sure what he's about and what his purpose is. I'll agree with you there. But again, I know it sounds like a terrible excuse. They just make him such a cool motherfucker that I just kind of ignore that. Like, he's just a cool guy. Like,
Damon, I forgave a lot about this movie because it's just fucking cool. Like, it just is. Like, I was like, yeah, but it's cool. You know what I mean? Like, oh, that's wrong, but it's cool, so it doesn't matter. Like, I know I would have just ate this movie up as a kid, like 100% for sure. I guess if I was going to do a rewrite of The Living Dead, I would do something that really pushed Top Dollar to act. I knew I could pick up, like, oh, this guy's kind of fucking with my business by messing up Gideon's pawn shop, because a lot of my money flows through that. It didn't feel like it impacted him, and I just loved like especially in the buildup, because again, this is my first time watching this. In this buildup, I go, Top Dollar's so fucking cool. He's the coolest guy next to the Crow. Like, the Crow and Top Dollar are the coolest motherfuckers in this movie. Like, I really want to see him go at the Crow. Like, how are they going to, how is it going to collide? And I think the collision it didn't feel like as dramatic as Top Dollar and the Crow are. They're these dramatic, like, set, these dramatic, like silhouettes and icons and these symbols. it would have been cooler to see something light under Top Dollar where he's like, you know, like Gary Oldman in that one movie, Leon.
Oh
You know,
yeah,
like where
the
he's just,
professional.
yeah, the professional, like he's going to tear the city down because of this guy. That's what I was kind of looking for in Top Dollar, and it was just sort of like, I'm gonna snort coke until you show up.
I
I'm gonna
think it was
me
almost
and Bai Ling are gonna do weird brother sister shit until you show up. Like it wasn't, again, Damon, it's cool. Like, don't get me wrong. It looks great. It's cool. I want to live wherever Top Dollar lives. I want to hang out with him. But I was just looking for that thing, you know, that thing where it's just like, I will tear this city limb from limb until I get my hands on the Crow and then beat him to near death. And then the Crow wins. Like, that's what I was kind of waiting for.
and my only pushback to that, two things about that. One, they never say his name in this movie. You never hear Top Dollar. The only way you know his name is Top Dollar is with the credits.
Yeah.
I think they just paint him as this shadowy figure that's lurking
Yeah.
nearby. And I think the reason why he doesn't have that big confrontation with the Crow until he shows up to get Skank and he says, "So you're him, the Avenger." He just disregards him. He doesn't consider him a threat
Right.
because nobody's a threat to him. And if this was an 8-episode prestige television show, they redid The Crow and it's like an HBO series and it was just as dark and dour and all the things were right, Top Dollar wouldn't show up till episode 4. Like, you see all these guys carrying out all these different acts, and then you find out there's a guy pulling the strings behind the scenes, and that's where you meet Top Dollar. This is sandwiched into a movie. And so that's the way I took it, just because he's so powerful, he's so untouchable, that he's just like, this guy's not going to get to me. And so when even when he shows up, he's talking shit to him. He's just like, "Oh, you're him. You're the Avenger." And when they all shoot him, he's just like, "Ooh, that had dirt." He doesn't give a shit about this guy. He doesn't buy it. He doesn't believe it. He doesn't.
Yeah.
He doesn't think this guy's in. So I think that's that swagger / cockiness is just the position of power he's in. But I understand what you're talking about. I mean, I understand where you're coming from. But that's
it was
just
more
the
like
way
a
I took it.
yearning for it. It wasn't that it was like,
Yeah.
I don't get this. It was just more like, damn, like I wish he just wanted to lay waste to the city to find this Crow to hunt him down. Like I was looking for that.
The last thing I'll say about that, and here's where Top Dollar became the character that I loved about this movie. Like, he's just such a great villain. When he finally lures the Crow to the church, when he kidnaps Sarah and they shoot the Crow and they get him to lose his powers, Top Dollar's talking shit to him. He's like, "Hey, I just want you to know, like, what happened to your girlfriend and you? Yeah, that was my call. I ordered that building cleared." He just doesn't give a shit. Like, he's so in control and so powerful that, like, even in that moment, after knowing that the Crow, watching him take 180 bullets to the chest in his war room and wiping out every crime boss except him and killing Skank and even standing down a group of cops who show up, even in that moment, he's still just like very, very like laissez-faire. He's like, "Oh yeah, by the
it's
way,
consistent.
I'm the one who ordered that building cleared. I'm the one who basically had your fiance tortured and killed and had you chucked out a window, and I don't give a shit." That attitude in that moment was just the definition of that character. Of just, he is just so evil and so powerful that he just doesn't think anything can get to him. And I think that's where, if you have him go on this rage-filled, like, you know, I gotta find the Crow, that would mean the Crow got to him. The whole movie, he doesn't care. He's like, "Yeah, whatever. Like, you killed Tintin, you killed T-Bird. I don't give a shit." It's not until that moment when he shows up in the boardroom and he kills all the other crime figures and he realizes this is a supernatural thing, then he finds. But even in that moment, when he's talking shit to him in the church, like, "Yeah, I'm the one who ordered your family, your girlfriend killed." I think that's the definition of that character, where he's just like, "I don't care. I don't give a shit. Like, I'm gonna get you, and I don't care what you're doing. You're not gonna get me." And that hubris is eventually what costs him. But I think that's kind of the definition of that character.
No, you're 100% right. It's a consistent character trait. Like I could not criticize this as being inconsistent. It was just something that, like, I was yearning for. Like that's all. Like that's really all it was. Yeah. But like I was like, yeah, it's consistent. Like he is this guy the whole way through. where
Yeah.
I was just like, when Michael and David collide in Lost Boys, like David's had enough. You know what I mean? Like Michael and his brother have gone too far, so now David has to bite back. Like before that, like there was nothing that could shake David. Like all those moments that him and Michael kind of butted heads, he liked it. He was playing with him. It was fun to him. And that's very much like Top Dollar, where it's just like, cool, do whatever you want. I don't really give a shit. I'm a fucking badass. Like, there's nothing you can do to me, really. That's very much how Top Dollar is. But there was that like bridge too far, and I was just looking for it. But the character of Top Dollar, you are right, and I do agree, is consistently who he is. Like, that's legit. Like, I can't argue that. He is very much laissez-faire. He is blasé. He is cool as ice. And that, by the way, that is hypnotic. That is fucking, that's what the children call Riz these days, Damon. He's got it in fucking, in Googles and goggles and mountains of white powder. He's got that fucking Riz.
Like everything he does is cool. Like when he's sitting there in the chair talking to his sister and she drops the cocaine on the burning eyeball and he sniffs up the smoke and he goes, blows out the side of his mouth, he goes, yummy. It's just everything he does is cool. Like, and even when he kills Gideon and he stabs him in the throat with a knife, he's like, oh, die already, give me that thing, shoots him and hands it back to Tony Todd. He's like, thanks. Like, it's just so cool.
That's the thing why I think, like, thank goodness I was of this time, because I think if you would have showed that to like a Gen Z person now, you'd show them like a movie like this, a movie like The Crow, they'd go, this is corny. But I'd be like, no, that's the language of that time. Like, that's how characters were painted back then. So even though it was all brand new to me, it still was that language of the 80s and 90s over the top characters. Did you ever watch the show Key and Peele?
Oh yeah.
Oh my God. Like, for everybody who knows who Jordan Peele is, he's a master of fucking horror. But there was this one sketch, I can watch it 1,000 times over, where Key comes in and he's playing like a cop, and it's totally an 80s thriller, and he's in this fun house with all these mirrors. Have you ever seen this one?
I don't think I have, actually.
Oh fuck. It'd be dumb for me to try and describe it here, but it is ripped right out of 80s, 90s cop thrillers. And the character that Jordan Peele plays is very much a Top Dollar type, where he's just like he toys with this cop in a way that like is like, that's so over the top and stupid. But I'll have to send you a link to that. It's such a fucking funny sketch, but it tonally very much reminds me of something like The Crow, where it's just like, these guys aren't even on this planet. Like, they are so on the space cake that they just why do they behave this oddly? I know now, I understand why The Crow is being remade for Gen Z, because Gen Z would watch that movie and go, that is absolutely ridiculous and stupid. What on earth is that? So I'm very curious to see what the update, which we should probably start talking about that remake at some point, because it's coming very soon and we'll be talking about it on the show.
You mentioned, I got to throw this out there, now you say this, that era, when you think about the bad guys that era, that were actually bad guys, no redeemable qualities, but they were cool motherfuckers. You think about Alan Rickman in Die Hard.
So good.
Evil, but who doesn't? I mean, just the way he
You wanted to have dinner with the guy. Like, he's so fucking
he was great.
cool.
And then Mr. Joshua in Lethal Weapon, Gary Busey, like that was great. You think about just all those great action movies, even Jack Palance in Tango and Cash. Like, he was just such an evil, like just sadistic dude, but there was just such a charisma about him that carried it through. And I think all those movies that late 80s, early 90s, where the bad guys were, I mean, again, now this is a little different. Of course, Fast and Furious totally ripped this off, but even Patrick Swayze in Point Break, which I just rewatched recently. Now, that was set up a little differently because they didn't tell you he was the bad guy right away, but he had such a charisma to him. You loved that character. You loved Bodhi. And then you find out he's the bad guy, and you're like, oh, I got to root against this guy now? Like, I got to root against my favorite character? And that's what, basically they ripped off the entire concept and turned into Fast and Furious with cars instead of surfboards.
And made billions of dollars.
And good on you, man. Good on you for doing it. I'm not faulting you for it. But yeah, when you said that, I was like, yeah, it's like, because I love Alan Rickman in Die Hard. Like, he is such an asshole bad guy, but man, you love him. Like, you just love his character. He's one of the best parts about that movie.
Oh, 100%, dude. It really is something. It's really of its time. And if you're listening to this and you haven't seen The Crow, well, join the club now because I've joined the club. It's a great time capsule of like that era and the influence of all the eras that came before it.
So I want to dip into two real quick discussions before we get to categories, and that's going to lead us into talking about the remake. But I want to start with the lore of The Crow and the attention that this film gets on a lot of different levels. Of course, we can't do this podcast without talking about the tragedy that happened on set, which was the death of Brandon Lee. It was one of the final days of shooting. It was actually a reshoot of the original opening scene, which is when Eric Draven walks in the apartment and he finds his girlfriend slash fiance Shelley Webster being attacked by these group of thugs. If you watch the film version, you see it's Tintin throws a knife at him and he goes down, and then they chuck him out the window, which I did. So I've seen The Crow 100 times. I've watched documentaries about it, and I don't know if I just never connected the dots, but there were two stunt doubles who doubled Brandon Lee on set. The main one who ended up standing in for him when they finished filming was Chad Stahelski, who is now the director of all the John Wick films. He's gone on to become one of the greatest action directors of all time. He was a stuntman back then. But the scene was set up where basically Brandon Lee was walking in the room and Funboy, played by Michael Massey, fires a gun at him and he gets shot and goes down, and then they chuck him out the window. They were doing a reshoot because the original version didn't get a good enough close-up on the gun and Brandon walking in, so they reshot his final 3 days. The saddest part about this was it was in late March when he died. 3 weeks later, he was supposed to fly out and get married to his fiancee, Eliza Hutton. If you watch the end of The Crow, it says for Brandon and Eliza. She was there on set. Obviously, we all know the tragic story. There was a gun that was filled with blanks. There's two different kinds of cartridges they used with guns at that point. There were blanks that showed you kind of like the explosion, and then there were the ones that looked more authentic of like a bullet coming out of a gun, but it was a blank. The gun had been fired. There was a little piece of shrapnel left in there. The gun, the armorer, which we all know that word now, sadly, because of the Rust tragedy with Alec Baldwin, the armorer had gone home, and so there was only like basically an assistant coordinator there. He didn't check the barrel of the gun, which is a huge no-no in the movie business. This changed, sadly, until Rust, it changed everything in the movie industry because you have to clear the gun before you ever fire it. There was still gunpowder in the blank, and when the gunpowder ignited it, it shot out the piece of shrapnel, and it went in Brandon Lee's abdomen. In the moment when it happened, everyone on set, he was supposed to fall over and double over in pain anyways. But they didn't realize for a minute there that he didn't get up. And then they realized he actually got shot. He was rushed to the hospital and died a few hours later, very sadly died a few hours later. And this tremendously affected everything about this film. It affected, I mean, Alex Proyas left, went home to Australia and said, I'm done. I'm not finishing this movie. Michael Massey, who was the actor who played Funboy, who fired the gun that sadly ended up killing Brandon Lee, he took off a year of acting. He went home to New York, and it haunted him for the rest of his career. He sadly died of stomach cancer a couple of years ago, and I pulled a clip. He only talked about this a couple of times in his entire career, and he didn't actually address this until, I want to say, like 2005. He did an interview with Extra, of all places, and he talked about how much this affected him. And I want to play this clip from this interview with Michael Massey where he talked about the tragedy on set with Brandon Lee.
I mean, what happened to Brandon was a tragic accident, and it's something that I'm gonna live with. It's taken me, took me the time it took to be able to not so much put it in perspective, but to be able to move on with my life. It's not that I've been avoiding talking about it. It's just it doesn't seem to me to be relevant to anybody else except the people that were involved. And to me, for my journey through life, how I was able to get to the other side of it. And it was a very slow and thoughtful process. I mean, I didn't know it was thoughtful at the time, but I just took a year off and I went back to New York and didn't do anything. I didn't work, didn't do anything. I just spent it with close friends and family, and just to get through it like any of us get through a tragedy. But it was a tragedy. The only difference with this tragedy is that it happened with cameras rolling, and it was a big media thing. I don't think you ever get over something like that and say, no, I've gone through it a lot, and things keep changing.
And he said up until his death, it was something that always haunted him. He never got really over it. He did go on to do other roles. As I mentioned, he had a great role in the first season of 24. Great character actor, but he admitted throughout his career, he never really got past this. It haunted him. Certainly not his fault. He didn't do anything wrong, but he was holding the gun that fired the blank that killed Brandon Lee, and he never got past it. Brandon Lee, 28 years old when he died, and this was his breakout role. Everything he had done before this were kind of those action. He did Rapid Fire, I think was a movie he did. Just these very like, one note action characters because he was Bruce Lee's son, and unlike his father, who always said, I'm a martial artist first, I'm an actor second, Brandon Lee kind of carried the second mantra, which was he was an actor first and a martial artist second. He grew up and learned his father's art of Jeet Kune Do under one of his father's biggest students, and he was a martial artist, but this was the film that really allowed him to stretch his muscles acting-wise. And after this, he had talked about wanted to do comedies, wanted to do more dramas. He wanted to kind of get away from action roles. And this was supposed to be his standout performance where people could see he could act. And it wasn't just an action piece. And sadly, of course, he died on set and never got the chance to do that. And my own perspective, real quick, just to tell this story, years ago, I was at a UFC fan expo, and I want to say it was Houston or Dallas. I can't remember which city it was. And I was on the floor, and somebody's like, hey, did you want to meet Shannon Lee, who is Brandon's sister and Bruce Lee's daughter? And I said, of course I want to meet Shannon Lee. Oh, my God. So I walked over, met her, incredibly nice woman. And, of course, I think at the time they had released action figures for her father, Bruce Lee. It was like the first licensed action figure of her dad. And this was like maybe 2009, 2007. I can't remember the exact timeline. And so, everyone's talking about Bruce Lee. It's UFC, of course, everyone's talking about Bruce Lee. And I walked up and I said, I just want you to know that The Crow is one of my all-time favorite movies. It's been one of the most influential movies of my career, and I loved your brother Brandon and everything he ever did, but I just can't say how much that movie means to me. And I just want to say, I just wanted to say that to you because I wanted to say how much it means to me. And she gave me a hug. And she just said, thank you so much for saying that. Because obviously, and I understand it, like her dad is he's still to this day such a huge pop culture figure. And Brandon, sadly, really got cut down before he ever really got to live his life as an actor and even as a martial artist. And so she gave me a hug, and it was kind of an emotional moment for me because, I loved him. This movie meant so much to me as a kid to tell her that in person and have her give me a hug and say, thank you for saying that about my brother, just meant the world to me. It's an interaction I will never, ever forget.
Yeah, it's a wonderful thing. Yeah, and she's sort of the tenant of the legacy of that family anyway. I think she has a lot to do with how their rights are used and all of that stuff. But you can't even imagine. And I'll get on one little soapbox here, and because it's not a 100% thing, but it's very interesting. So obviously this happened, and then pretty much all the standards changed in Hollywood because he died. And then we had this thing happen with Alec Baldwin and Rust just a few years ago. They moved this production to North Carolina to escape any union rules. They were doing it on the cheap. That happens all the time. That happens with 90% of the horror movies we talk about. So it's nothing new. But when you enter firearms into the situation and you're doing it non-union, things like this happen. And the only other time this has happened since Brandon Lee died was on Rust, where they went non-union to save a few bucks. Not every union is perfect. Not every union can avoid something like this. And there have been plenty of non-union instances where firearms were used and no one got hurt. But when you skirt it or you try to cheapen out on something as important as this, tragedy can happen, and it's happened twice in this exact same situation. I'm not saying it couldn't happen the other way, but damn if it's weird that the only times it has happened is when they tried to skirt the rules to save a few bucks. Save as many bucks as you need to on your movie, except for in that particular space. If you're using firearms, just don't. Just don't scrimp. Don't find money somewhere else in the budget, move it over to make sure you got the best of the best doing that stuff. So it doesn't happen, because it's an absolute tragedy what happened. Didn't need to happen. When I'm just curious, that subject over. When you were a kid, was it even in your head? Because I mean, for whatever reason, it was in mine. I couldn't get it out of my head. But when you were watching the movies as a kid, was it even like circling in your brain?
It was, and also just for full disclosure, we talk about unions. I am a member of an entertainment union. I'm in the Writers Guild of America. So just to be clear about that, just for full disclosure, and I'm with you on that. Not because
I'm not part of any union. I very much believe in the safety that comes with it.
And I'm 100% on board. I want to mention that because I am in a union and I will advocate for that. That I think that while I do understand that productions have to cut costs, you can't cut costs on safety. And I think this is a tragic reminder of that 30 years after the fact. And sadly, we didn't learn our lesson, because even one more tragedy should never happen. And
it's one too many, yeah.
And so we have to talk about that. So I 100% agree with you. As far as the time goes, yes, because I do remember when this happened, and because I always back then, and when people hear this, they're going to laugh because it's not a thing today. I got all of my pop culture news from MTV News in those days.
Same.
And in those days, Kurt Loder, Tabitha Soren, I remember the names. Yes. They had like a half-hour show on MTV News where they broke down music stories, movie stories. It was the Fangoria Rolling Stone magazine of TV. It was all the news I cared about. It wasn't about politics and of course, some of that would jump in there occasionally, but it was about there's a new Pearl Jam tour, a new Nirvana. That's where I think I mentioned this on the show before. That's where I learned about Kurt Cobain's death. I came home from school one day, flipped on MTV, and there was Kurt Loder telling me that Kurt Cobain had died in 94. If I'm not, was it 94?
I think it was 94. Yeah.
So that's where I got my news. So when it happened, it was big news. It was huge news. Now, the biggest difference in 1994, and again, I don't think this is anyone's fault. I don't think this was MTV News' fault. This was no one's fault. Everyone just painted it as this tragic accident. And I know it was a tragic accident.
Of course.
But now knowing what we know, and even in that moment knowing that the armorer had gone home and it was an assistant who didn't check the gun, it's not an accident in a lot of ways.
It's negligence, yeah.
It's negligence. And even back then, they didn't file charges. There was no... it's wild to me to think about this now, 30 years later. Like, how somebody didn't go to jail for that is wild to me. And yes...
There was a civil lawsuit eventually.
But criminal charges. I'm not saying you have to go to prison for the rest of your life. I'm not saying that, but somebody should have. The guy died. That's tragic. So at the time, all I remember hearing was it was a tragic accident. Now we heard bits and pieces, and all we heard was the gun fired, and there was a something of a blank that misfired. Is what I remember being told was misfired, and it fired out a blank and hit him in the abdomen and killed him. We didn't hear any of the other stuff. At least I don't remember ever hearing about the guy didn't clear the gun. He didn't do he didn't check it.
Yeah, I saw that stuff back then. Yeah,
I didn't remember that back then. I just remember it was a tragic accident, and so. That's how it started, was when he died. And then a few months later, we hear about they're going to go back and finish it. They've agreed to go back and finish it. They're going to put another $8 million into it. They're going to finish it. And then in whatever, I don't remember the timeline of when I saw the first trailer or when I first heard The Crow was coming out in May of 1994. But they didn't say it in the trailers. They were not like, this is a film that Brandon Lee died filming.
Right. They didn't promote it like that. No.
But you knew it. This is Brandon Lee's finest work, his masterpiece. You heard it in the trailer I played at the start of the show. So it was very present. Now, I'll fully admit, I love The Crow regardless. I love this movie. But I'd be lying if I said that all the circumstances surrounding it don't make it its own special thing because of the tragedy that occurred there. Not because I'm saying you can't criticize this movie surely because a tragedy happened. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that when you encapsulate everything about this movie, from the tragedy with Brandon Lee to the decision to go back to film it, all the stories about it, you put it in a big capsule, and this is 1994 wrapped up in a bubble for me. And so I'll fully admit I love this film regardless, but I do know that part of my adoration, part of my almost obsession with this film comes from all the events that led up to this film's release. I know that. I'm not going to deny that.
And there's something else about that too, and it's so weird. 1994, Kurt Cobain died the same year. Kurt Cobain died at literally the peak of his career. I mean, he was literally they weren't on a downward trend. The other bands were on downward trends. Like, when Lane Staley and Alice in Chains died, they were already sort of out of the zeitgeist. Like, people kind of stopped caring. Their albums weren't selling as big anymore. Sadly, Chris Cornell, he died like really late in his career, like long after the glory days. Kurt Cobain died right at the peak. I mean, literally, he couldn't have been bigger. He could not have been a bigger deal. Months before that, he delivered what I think is probably the best Nirvana performance. That Unplugged performance, to me, is my favorite thing they've ever done. It was months before he died. Brandon Lee, same situation, where he was like on this rise. And then this film comes out. It probably would have been an even bigger film, honestly, if he had lived. Because it's not like it shattered the box offices. It did well, but it didn't do what the kind of numbers that you would call like a historically big film. It was a cult hit, truly. But it is of that time. It's a perfect time capsule. By the way, just a note, I spent 15 years working proudly for MTV News until they were disbanded unceremoniously last year. But I digress. The weird thing is that the fact that Brandon Lee also died at his peak means the same thing it means the same thing for when Kurt Cobain died at his peak. They will always live in that moment. They will always live at the height of what they did. Kurt Cobain isn't going on TV or Joe Rogan telling people the earth is flat and 2 times 2 should equal 17. Like, he's not out there doing that. He's not out there rambling and saying weird shit and telling you who to vote for or anything like that. Kurt Cobain died literally frozen in time as the biggest rock star of his entire generation. And Brandon Lee that's a weird way to say that. Brandon Lee is frozen in time as this icon of early 90s like goth culture, basically. Like he is a absolute template for goth culture. Now, I know goth culture isn't like the biggest thing in the world, but also for movie culture, also for action culture, also for the history of his family. He's not walking around right now going on Fox News telling you who to vote for. He's not doing like he's frozen in time as The Crow. Or he didn't go off and do a bunch of embarrassing movies after that made his career fizzle out. He did The Crow, and The Crow is a legendary movie. So there is something to that piece of the lore as well. When you die at the height of your powers, you are like sealed in as a legend.
And I will say, and I know you agree with me when I say this, I would trade all of that
100%.
For him to be able to go on Fox News right now and tell me who to vote for. I would give all of that back for him to be able to come out and tell me that he believes that the earth is flat and vaccines don't work and anything else wild Aaron Rodgers bullshit. I would give everything to see that guy come back, because
100%.
He died at 28, and that was just far too soon. I know you agree with that, and I agree with Kurt Cobain too. Like, would Nirvana be held in the same regard if he had stayed around and Foo Fighters never happened and they just kept? I don't know. I can't say that for certain. I have no idea.
Yeah, it's hard to say.
No. But because of what the tragedy that happened, I think Nirvana's held in a regard where they're still being listed like top 5, top 10 bands of all time, and they basically had 3 albums.
Yeah.
Because he died. I get what you're saying, but I would trade all that to see 100%. What he would have done with album 4, 5, 6, and 7. Who knows? I still love Pearl Jam to this day. Pearl Jam just put out a new album a couple of weeks ago. I still love Pearl Jam.
It's actually a pretty good album, by the way.
It is. It's a really good album. So yeah, no, I totally understand what you're saying. Now, with that being said, before we get to categories, we got to have this discussion because we all know later this year. Now, part of this, we originally planned to review The Crow now anyways because it was the 30th anniversary, but part of our plan was to roll this out because The Crow remake was coming out in June. Now, it's pushed back to August, but it felt like, let's just go ahead and do this because it is the 30th anniversary, and let's be honest, a lot of the people who loved The Crow from 1994 are not excited about the remake coming out in August anyway, so it's not like this is an homage or people are like, ooh, we can't wait. The Crow remake is coming out starring Bill Skarsgård, directed by Rupert Sanders, and we've seen the trailer. I think there was a couple trailers actually. I know it's
at least two right now.
Yeah. And they pushed it back June to August. I don't exactly know why. Maybe they realized, hey, releasing it right around the 30th anniversary of the original Crow, probably not the best idea. When it came out, you know how they have like the like and dislike buttons on YouTube? The likes were like 67,000, dislikes were like 99,000. This was one of the most divisive trailers I have ever experienced. Now, if you go back on my TikTok, Damon of the Dead on TikTok, I did a video about this. And I actually told my Shannon Lee story a little bit in that TikTok. You will not find a bigger fan of The Crow than the guy sitting in this seat right now. I've told you the story. I'm not going to go over it again. This movie is top 3 for me for any number of reasons. Top 3 film, period. Not horror film, just film. But even I was like, you can't be precious about it because at the end of the day, like it or not, I understand Alex Proyas put out a couple statements saying this is horrible. Brandon Lee died making this. You can't redo it. But here's my point. And I know people are going to bump up against this, and I'm fine. And I'm saying this as the Crow representative here, Patrick, because I am the Crow fan. This was an adaptation. This was a comic book.
Yeah.
Adapted. Now, if Brandon Lee wrote The Crow, starred in The Crow, produced The Crow, and then died making The Crow, I'd probably have a slightly different opinion because I think so. But this isn't. It's an adaptation. Listen, I loved the Superman films growing up as a kid. Christopher Reeve is my Superman. He still is to this day. I loved Smallville. I enjoyed Henry Cavill, and I'm looking forward to what they do in the new film by James Gunn. But I'm not upset that they're moving on to a new Superman because Christopher Reeve tragically died. Like, you can't hold on to things like that when it's already an adaptation. Again, I'd have a different feeling if this was Brandon Lee's brainchild, he created it.
Yeah.
It was all him. And then somebody's like, you know what? Let's take his idea and retwist it into a new one. I might have a bigger issue with that. This is a comic book. I mean, what happened to Brandon Lee was a tragedy, and it is awful. You will not find anyone more saddened by that occasion than I was as a kid, and even now, rewatching it, knowing we were going to talk about it, I almost rolled a tear. I was like, God, it hit me again, because like how much this movie means to me. But you can't be precious about that, because ultimately, like it or not, and this is what's going to upset some people, this is an adaptation. This was a comic book adapted into a film. I understand the tragedy of this. I do. But there was a tragedy. There was a TV show in the 30s or 40s, the Superman film that they made. What was it? The Ben Affleck movie. Was that movie called? The one about George.
Oh, geez. Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
The Superman, the guy who played Superman back in the TV show, he had died tragically. And, they didn't stop making Superman films because that guy died while he played Superman. This is an awful tragedy. We all admit that. We all feel horrible about it. But at the end of the day, this is adaptation. At its core, this is adaptation. I'm not precious about it in that way. Now, I can have an opinion about the trailer and what Rupert Sanders is going to do with it. That's a whole other subject. And can you compare the two? Yes, because they are using the same story. You can compare the films. You can. Just like you can compare Spider-Man Homecoming or Spider-Man Far From Home or No Way Home to the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man. You're allowed to do that. They're carrying the same material. You're allowed to compare those. You don't have to, but you can. But you can't say that it can't be done, is all my point. You can't sit here and say, oh, just because this happened, and while it is awful what happened, that doesn't stop them from adapting, because ultimately, like it or not, The Crow is an adaptation of a comic book. it was already adapted. This wasn't Brandon Lee's story. We'd love it because it was his story, but it's not him. And again, I would have a much bigger, different problem otherwise.
I couldn't have said it better. It is just a story that is being bought and used. It was being bought and used in 1993 or when they were making it. It's the same thing. So you're 100% right there. I, unlike most Crow fans, am so excited to see what they do with the Bill Skarsgård Crow. I'm very excited because this leads to my second issue with the movie. It's not even a big issue. In fact, I wouldn't even call it an issue so much as like, I see an opportunity. A lot of revenge movies from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s that we enjoyed, they did a great job at just leaving out the victims of the revenge. They were always an afterthought. There might have been a scene where like Charles Bronson was having sex with his wife because that's how you did it back in the 70s and 80s. Like that was their moment. In this movie, his girl Shelley. Sorry, remember I've only seen this movie once. She's really truly in the background of this movie. She barely exists in this movie. And then in that moment at the end, when the Crow finally brings him to her, or she's coming to him, I wouldn't say it didn't have impact. Like I understood what the Crow was what Eric's character was going through to get back to her. I got that. I get it. And it was on par with every revenge movie I've ever enjoyed, which is the victim I was after is a blip in the story. We have an opportunity with remakes to get it better. Maybe they might get it better, but the opportunity I see is to really make me believe that Bill Skarsgård and as FKA Twigs, right, is his girl in this, to build their relationship already in the trailer. There's more interaction between them than there ever was in the Crow movie. There's already more story. I can already feel it. So maybe, just maybe, if it does follow the same storyline, I'm not quite sure how tightly it will follow it, but there will at least be this emotional weight that didn't exist in most any revenge movie from my childhood, where I want to be on the verge of tears when the Crow reunites with his woman. I want to be I want to be taken on that journey. I want all the blood. I want all the guts and all the gore, and I can see it already in the trailer. The Red Band trailer is gory and hardcore as shit. They're going hard, which sign me up. So I want all that. I want all the bloody revenge, but I want the emotional weight of why the revenge was there in the first place, which is lacking in The Crow. But again, that's not really a criticism of The Crow. That's just a criticism of the storytelling of the 40 years prior. They just go, oh yeah, the person over there that I lost. Let me get to the killing. So I'm excited for that because I see it as an opportunity to improve. Yes, it can, but at least this element, maybe everything else will suck, maybe. But maybe they can improve in that arena.
Let me give you a little inside baseball here. So we were talking about The Crow, getting ready for the episode and texting back and forth as you and I tend to do pretty much every day. And we were talking about this, and you said in text, I have 2 issues with The Crow. And immediately my heart sunk because I was like, this is going to turn into an ugly podcast because this is like my movie, and I know I'm gonna fiercely defend it, and it's gonna turn into an argument. And certainly, we don't always have to agree on movies. There's a lot of movies we disagreed on, and we do argue about why or why not we like certain things, and that's totally okay. That's part of a review podcast. We've said many times in the show, we will never lie to our audience. I will never lie to you to say I like something I didn't like just because I'm trying to get more attention on TikTok or Instagram or a podcast. Right. If I don't like a movie, I'm going to tell you I don't like a movie. So I got a little scared. I was like, oh, God, Patrick's good. Both of your points that you made about the things that you had an issue with, even though I kind of explained away my version of why Top Dollar didn't bother me. I get it. I get where you're coming from. But that's more of just like a personal preference. That's not really
totally personal preference.
Yeah, that's not even like I have a huge issue with the film. It's more of like I just wish it was this way. What you're saying about Shelley in this film, I would actually say I agree with you. I would agree with you. Now, I love the film. I do. I consider it almost a perfect film because of everything that goes around it and how it's filmed, the sound, everything. I love this film. It's, to me, almost a perfect film. But I would agree, like giving Shelley more to grab onto, just like we talked about the villains, like giving us something to grab onto with the personalities, the way they dress, all those kind of things. We get these fleeting moments of Shelley, and the fleeting moments are cool. Like when you see them when they get engaged, she goes upstairs, finds the ring. Yeah. They have these little flashback moments, and when Eric goes in the apartment, he has these flashbacks. We understand he loves Shelley. This is a love that travels across time. We understand that, and I think the character we spend more time with, where we actually understand how much Shelley meant to everybody, was Sarah, the little girl who she kind of takes care of because her mom's a drug addict and, you know, hanging out with Fun Boy and doing all kinds of awful things at the pit. What they get right about Shelley is we learned that Eric, absolutely, this was a love story. They were meant to be together. I don't believe in destiny and that kind of stuff, fate. I certainly don't believe in that. But if you're gonna equate it to something, they were meant to be together. And we also learned that Shelley was a great person because she was trying to save her building. The people who lived in her building, they were trying to be evicted for the wrong reasons. Sarah loved her, looked at her as like a surrogate mom. Shelley was a good person, and she got rubbed out by a group of criminal thugs. We care.
Oh, yeah.
But I agree with you that giving that a little bit more story and understanding and knowing who Shelley was and making us grow even more attached to Shelley is not a bad idea. I know from reading a couple interviews with Rupert Sanders with this film, he said that one of the biggest differences between his version of The Crow and the 1994 version is he does flesh out Shelley and Eric's relationship more in this film, and the reason they get killed by the big bads in this film is different. They're not just getting evicted from their building. It almost feels like that was a random act of violence. It didn't matter. It could have been anybody, but they were just being eradicated from that apartment. Top Dollar didn't say, "Oh, it's Eric Draven and Shelley Webster." Fuck them.
There was no motive, really.
That's why at the end, when he's so blasé about it, he said, "Oh yeah, I'm the one who ordered you." Because he didn't give a shit. He didn't care about you. He didn't care you're Eric Draven, the rock star, and she's Shelley Webster. He didn't care who you were. You were nameless and faceless to him. It seems like what Rupert Sanders is doing in this one is it's a little more personal. We're getting to know the characters a little bit more. Now, I'm all for that. Now, that being said, the trailer, I mean, yes, there are some concerns here. The whole, like, he made this quote about using the Post Malone Ozzy Osbourne song, which is a song I actually really like, but he said he wanted to make it like the Gen Z version, so he injected that.
What he's doing.
I'm like, all right, I kind of get it, but that, to me, like, make the movie you want to make. Don't make it. You and I have had this discussion many times, and I know you agree with me on this. Stop with the fan service bullshit. Don't try make your film. Don't make your film.
I mean, in this instance, they didn't give a shit about the fan service because the fans of The Crow were like, "What the fuck is that?"
And that's what I'm saying. Like, they were trying to make it for the new generation. He's like, I'm trying to serve. Don't just make your movie. If you love that Post Malone song and Ozzy Osbourne, just say that. Don't tell me you're trying to service the Gen Z crowd by putting this song in there. But beyond that, the trailer's fine. I mean, the look of The Crow is a little odd. The paint, it almost looks like Jared Leto's Joker in Suicide Squad. And again, I don't really have a huge it's weird. Because the only reason I bump up against that is because every version of The Crow looks similar to the Eric Draven,
right?
The Crow, the longer greasy hair, the white paint with the black, the clown makeup almost. Okay, I get it. You're trying to differentiate it between the 1994 Crow. To me, you can almost go to it's like when they made the other Superman movies and they're like, well, we can't have him in the red and blue underwear. We gotta put him in. Don't fuck with it too much. Like, put the S on his chest. Put him in the fucking tights. We know it's Superman. Don't fuck with it. Like, it's okay. I think it was okay if Bill Skarsgård looked like the Crow we all recognize. I don't think you need to change it and make him street thug looking because you're trying to differentiate it from the 1994 Crow. But again, even in my TikTok, what I said was based on a picture and a 2-minute trailer. I have no idea. I can't tell you if this is going to be good or bad. I'm going to be there on opening night to see it. Now, if I walk out of there and I'm blown away, guess what? I'll come on this podcast and say, I was blown away. What a great job, Rupert Sanders. And if I walk out of that theater and it's a piece of shit, I will come on this podcast and say, wow, Rupert Sanders, this is a piece of shit. I'm not going in prejudging it because I love the 1994 Crow. I think that's what you have to separate yourself from. they're not doing this to insult. I mean, he keeps saying they want to do it to honor Brandon Lee. I appreciate them saying that, but ultimately they're just adapting source material. Make your film. Don't try to appease anybody, and just make your film. And I'm going to go in and like it or dislike it based on that film, not because I love the 1994 Crow.
You got to go into everything fresh. You got to. I don't want to tell anyone how to enjoy anything, and everyone gets upset when you do anyway. But I promise you, if you go into movies putting all the past behind you and just experiencing what's in front of you, you'll just feel better, even if you hate the movie. If you don't come in going, I can't wait to shit all over this movie. I fucking hate this. I want to see how bad this movie is. You're just drinking the poison for yourself. The movie's going to be the movie. They're going to see, it's going to happen the way it's going to happen. Storytellers will have been remaking things. The Thing that we love, the John Carpenter's The Thing, is a remake. Remakes happen all the fucking time. And I don't want to hear horror people get mad about that, because that's literally our trade. Our trade is remakes and sequels and legacy sequels and prequels and requels. That's what we do. So don't complain. I know it's your precious most favorite ever movie. Okay. But Damon can do it. I mean, God damn it. Damon basically is the Crow. He's basically modeled his life after the Crow. He goes around and kills street thugs, like, for fun. Sorry, I put that out there on air.
Don't tell that on the air right now. Jeez.
That it's okay to just come in cold, come in with a whole new perspective, and just see what's happening right in front of you. I guarantee you'll feel like at least this much better. But if you come in preloaded, ready to shit on something, why go see a movie? Why even bother seeing it? Just, if you truly hate the idea that it's being remade, just don't go see it. But please, if you show up in the theater that night, come in clean. No, I certainly, if I'm sitting in the theater, I don't want to hear you complaining about the movie the entire time, because you were ready to do that from moment one. Like, just come in, take the ride, and then assess it later. Assess it with us. We'll be talking about it on this podcast.
And I'm certainly not going to tell anyone to feel how you feel, how you want to feel. And
feel how you want to feel.
That's totally fine. But I will say this, and I'm not sitting there like, let's have a contest. But I'm saying this as an unabashed lover of the Crow, a guy who has every Crow memorabilia and literally saw this in the theater in 1984. I'm not saying I'm better or worse than anybody out there who loves the Crow. I'm just saying that you will not find a bigger fan of this movie than the guy sitting in the seat right now. This is one of my favorite 3 movies ever. And I'm okay with this. I'm not saying I'm going to like it or hate it. I have no idea. I'll find out in August. But if I'm okay with this, if you really wrap your head around it, I think you could be okay with this, is all I'm saying. Because if anyone should have a problem with this, it would be me, because I am the Crow fan. And I'm telling you that, like, yeah, I don't know. I mean, do I have issues like some of the looks and the music and some of the statements I heard? It's kind of, kind of dorky, or kind of like, oh, God, why do you do that? But I love Bill Skarsgård, and yeah, I'm interested to see what FKA twigs. And the best part is they have Danny Houston in this movie. Danny Houston is fucking fantastic. He's such a great actor. 30 Days a Night, one of our favorite vampire films. Mm-hmm. Danny Houston's the bad guy. I'm all over that. That guy's got, when I heard he got cast, I was like, oh, it's the Michael Wincott, because what a great, like, dark character actor who doesn't get nearly enough credit for how good he is. That's Danny Houston. So,
totally.
Yeah. Again, I have no idea. Maybe it'll be awful. I have no idea, but I'm going to go with an open mind and just hope that it's good. Like, I have no idea. I go into every movie hoping it's good. I'm disappointed sometimes, but I don't ever go into a movie prejudging, saying, oh my God, this is going to be awful. I never want to go into a theater like that, because you're just setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah, who would want to go to the movies ready to hate something? That sounds awful. Like, as somebody who goes to the movies as much as they possibly can, that sounds like a terrible way to go to a movie.
We just reviewed The Strangers Chapter 1. I went in that movie being like, I hope this is awesome. Now, did I leave excited and super enthusiastic? No. But did I go in thinking, I hope this is awesome? So you never know. Go in with an open mind is all I'm saying.
Every time.
All right, Patrick, let's get into categories. Let's kick things off as we do each and every week here with best performance. And I just want to say this off the top. I particularly, in as I said earlier, because this at the time was not a cast of like a big bunch of known actors, right? Like this is pretty, I mean, $15 million budget, 1994. These are all like kind of one role, two role kind of characters coming into this movie. Everyone in this movie to me is pretty great. Like I was shocked watching back like how well it holds up. But for you, Patrick, what was your best performance in The Crow?
Damon, my best performance goes to Winston Zeddemore himself. Ernie Hudson as Sergeant Albrecht. I don't, outside of Ghostbusters, I don't see a ton of Ernie Hudson. I really just don't. So it was just a surprise, and it was so cool to see him in this movie. But he genuinely had a great, like he was playing this cop who was trying to figure out what was going on. He's sort of the lead because almost like the Crow is almost ethereal. Like he just kind of pops in and out. He's almost a ghost. So the groundedness of the story really lays on Ernie Hudson's big, broad, muscular 80-something-year-old shoulders. He did a damn good job. Like, I just don't see him in a ton of stuff. And I was like, shit, like I'm buying what Ernie Hudson is selling here. And he needed to be sort of our human anchor in this movie. He did a fantastic job.
I'm going to say something right now. If my take on the Crow remake didn't get me banned from every Crow room, and this one's about to, I think this is Ernie Hudson's best role.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. I love Ghostbusters. We've done Ghostbusters reviews on here. I adore the Ghostbusters. That's a formula movie for me as well. That came out in 1984, the sequel in 87. I was a kid. Love both those movies. Still love them to this day. And I really loved Ghostbusters Afterlife. Not so much with the new one, but again, still enjoyed it. This, to me, is Ernie Hudson's best performance because he actually gets to chew on some scenery here. He's not just the sidekick character that he is as Winston Zeddemore. He is a lead, as you said. It's him and Brandon Lee leading this movie. Yeah. And he does a great – he is charismatic. He is sympathetic. He is dramatic. And that's a different role than that kind of comic sidekick character he plays in Ghostbusters. This is, to me – Ernie Hudson's best performance. I love this performance.
I'm glad you agree because I was just blown away. I was like, not only is it cool that Ernie Hudson's in this movie, he's doing a great job.
Absolutely. Now, for me, best performance, I almost gave it to David Patrick Kelly as T-Bird because I love him and he plays such a good thug bad guy, the leader of not the lead. He's not the leader, but he's the leader of his gang, and he's very much the grinning bad guy of that movie. But my best performance goes to none other than Michael Wincott as Top Dollar. Patrick, you know what this guy did? He wore the puffy shirt from Seinfeld and made it look fucking cool. He made it look cool. He wore the puffy shirt from Seinfeld and made it look cool. As you said, I understand where you're coming from with your slight criticism about his motivation. But as I said earlier, none of it mattered to me because this is such a cool motherfucker.
Cool as shit.
Michael Wincott, everything he does in this, you could just have a Michael Wincott supercut of The Crow. And
it's out there, and I'm probably going to have to go look for it.
And I'd be like, this is such a cool, like everything from the opening scene where he talks about, my daddy used to say, the moment you stop being a child, the moment you're gonna die. All these little lines, and then when when Beiling says, "How's she doing?" or something, he goes, "I think we broke her." Just like that voice, but every line he delivers, it's literally like they wrote dialogue for him to deliver the best one-liners throughout the entire movie. He's like, let's have a moment of introspection for poor old Tintin. He snorts the line of coke. Yeah. And then, as I said earlier, like when he talked about Gideon's, he goes, was that a natural disaster or an act of God? Call it my need to know. Everything he delivers is so good. And one of my favorites, I'm going to get to best line later, but one of my favorite lines in this entire movie is later when he attacks the Crow in the church and he delivers this. And I crack up every time I hear this line. And this is just definitive Michael Wincott in this movie.
Quick impression for you. Caw, bang, fuck, I'm dead.
He's just... Everything he does is great, and as I said, like he is the ultimate 90s villain, and I just loved everything about Michael Wincott in this movie.
If Quentin Tarantino loves anything about this movie, it's Michael Wincott. I mean, that is a full-blown Quentin Tarantino-style character who says over-the-top, really just, like mustache-twirling villainy. You know what I mean? Like it's of a bygone era, and that's why like I wouldn't necessarily like ding it for how cheesy it is, because it feels very apropos for what it is and for the time too. It's like, of course, this is the exact villain I need. He's in the Seinfeld shirt. He's wearing a silk vest. You know, he's clearly making out with his half sister. Like, yeah, he's fucking weird. Like, everything about this should be weird and operatic and strange. Michael Wincott leaned into it. I would argue this is one of his finest performances, right next to his performance as Antlers in Nope. I loved him in Nope. He's incredible in Nope, but he's also incredible in this.
Yeah, and I don't know. I've not read a lot of interviews with Michael Wincott, but all I say watching now this movie and remembering it years later is that, to me, I feel like this guy should have had a bigger career. And it's not, I don't know why. I'm not saying that, like, maybe he did this by choice. Like, maybe he just likes, maybe he's an artist and he likes painting and he just does movies every now and again to afford his painting habit. I have no idea. But every time I rewatch The Crow, I'm like, God, this guy should have been Alan Rickman. This guy should have been... Every time you're looking for like a great character actor to add to your movie, Michael Wayne. And to be fair, he did do a lot. I mean, he did do a lot.
Oh yeah, he's tons of work. But I know what you mean. He should have been like, why wasn't he a huge star? Why didn't he have a role in Harry Potter or some shit?
Like why is Marvel not running to get Michael Wincott to be a villain in the Marvel Cinematic Universe?
Don't they need Doctor Doom? Isn't he needed soon? Get Michael Wincott. Like, just. You're welcome, Kevin Feige. Michael Wincott's available to play Doctor Doom, and he will kick much fucking ass. Just fucking hire the guy.
Exactly. All right, let's move on to our MVP award, and this is the category we call our Ken Foray Banana Hammock MVP award, named after great character actor Ken Foray from the movie From Beyond, where he jumps down a flight of stairs and into a basement to stab a creature wearing nothing more than a thong bikini. If that's not an MVP performance, I don't know what is. So, Patrick, who gets your MVP for The Crow?
Oh, Damon, I gushed over his work earlier, but my MVP goes to Dariusz Wolski, who is the cinematographer on The Crow. Darius is like a prolific cinematographer, 78 cinematography credits to his name. I'll tell you this, Prometheus is one of them. We just talked about that. He's done a ton of Ridley Scott films, actually. The guy... He did something so magical here. He made this set in North Carolina feel like a sprawling city. He lit it so well. Like, and he got to use cool film stocks that no longer exist. I'm rehashing a little bit, but my point is that it's such a fucking cool looking movie. It looks beautiful, and Darius was the guy behind the lens going, if I point it like this and I do it like that, it's going to look awesome. And Alex Proyas was very smart to go, hell fucking yeah. Like, there was just so many moments in this movie that looked so gorgeous, no matter what they were. There's like no bad shots in this movie. This movie just looks incredible. So I had to give my MVP this time to Darius, our heroic cinematographer.
You know what I love about this is because this is filmed in North Carolina, and you would never know that.
No,
as I said, they never say it's Detroit, but that's where Devil's Night is famous. Is Detroit?
Yeah, and they did say Motor City at one point.
Yeah. Which one of you Motor City motherfuckers wants to bet this one isn't loaded? So you kind of understand it's Detroit. This looks like Detroit. It's wet, it's grimy, and I've been to Detroit many times. I actually like Detroit. Detroit gets a bit of a bad reputation, but I like Detroit.
If you're listening in Detroit, give us a shout, because I fucking love Detroit.
I love Detroit. I go up there for shows and all kinds of stuff. I love Detroit. But I get like the look of it. I live in Ohio, so I'm right next to Michigan. Like, there are that grimy, kind of dirty, wet feel when it rains. You get that kind of stuff. I get it. I understand. And to do that, and like, it's easy to go to Toronto and make that stand in for New York City. It's a cheaper way to film in Canada than going into New York, but you can make it look. I've always joked that I think Toronto's like a cleaner New York City. That's like the joke about Toronto. That's why so many New York films shoot in Toronto. It's basically looks like a lot like New York. Vancouver stands in for a lot of cities in that way. LA, sometimes even New York. They use Vancouver downtown, things like that. To take North Carolina and turn it into Detroit, that's a fucking feat of magic. And great.
That was all done on sets. You know, it was all done on sound stages. Yeah.
But so still, the fact that they did it, like it, and it doesn't look like a soundstage.
No, that's part of, choosing the right lens for Darius to go, well, how do I make these sets that are clearly probably miniatures that are forced perspective to make them look like they're sprawling. You got to pick the right lens or it won't sell. Darius is just a legendary cinematographer, and this is, I think, some of his most amazing work. It truly is. It's staggering how good this movie looks.
Yeah. So now my MVP, I don't want to like twist this onto too much of a sad note, but my MVP goes to Linda Lee Cadwell and Eliza Hutton. That is Brandon Lee's mother, Linda Lee Cadwell, who was also Bruce Lee's wife, of course, and Eliza Hutton, who was Brandon Lee's fiance on set, who was supposed to marry Brandon Lee 3 weeks after this finished filming. When the tragedy happened with Brandon Lee, Alex Proyas flew home to Australia and said, I'm done. I can't finish this film. It's too much. I can't go back. It was only after Linda and Eliza, his mother and fiance, went to Alex and went to the studio and said, please finish this film. This was Brandon's masterpiece. This was the film that was going to make his career. This was the movie that was going to allow him to do drama and comedy and move on to do things beyond action. This was his opus. This was his moment. This was all he wanted. This was his baby. Please finish this film. And so the producers and everyone got together and they decided to go back to finish filming a few months later with an extra $8 million for reshoots and Chad Stahelski standing in for Brandon Lee in those final scenes, part of which was the fight scene with Top Dollar on top of the building. And then they digitally imposed Brandon Lee's face. Very early digital effects in 1994 for what is now kind of a standard.
It looked pretty good too, by the way.
It did. It did.
It's really hard to tell when it's happening.
But you have to remember, this doesn't happen if his fiance and his mother don't go to the studio and go to Alex Proyas and say, please finish this film for Brandon. He would want you to finish this film. Because if you think about it, of that time, like, they're going to go back and finish filming Rust. Does anyone give a fuck about Rust? I'm sorry. I don't.
Who gives a shit about that?
Like, I don't care. And the tragedy of that, like, I don't care. That's a film I would, like, I'm like you now, what you were in 1994. Like, the tragedy of it made you not want to, like, see the movie. Not that I was like rushing to go see Rust anyways, right. But after everything just gone out, I'm like, fuck that movie. I don't want anything to do with that. I
promise you, I was never planning to see Rust. Like, I already know that.
I wasn't either, but now I will openly openly revolt against going to see that movie. But this one, the fact that they were done, Proyas flew home to Australia and he's like, I can't do this. I can't film this movie after what happened. And it was his mother and his fiance who said, no, this is what Brandon would have wanted. And the only reason they went back was because his mother and his fiance said, please finish this for Brandon, because he would want the world to see this, because this was his masterpiece. And they went back and finished filming. The last few days of filming, over a few months, they reshot, and then they did the film. That's so beautiful to me, because if they would have never finished this and The Crow became that story of lore of like the tragic death of Brandon Lee and this film never saw the light of day, I don't think anyone could really be mad about that. Like, you can't say, oh, well, right. Why didn't you finish it? Well, yeah. He died on set. That's why you don't fucking finish it. It was his mom and his fiance who said, no, Brandon would have wanted this. He loved this movie. He wants the world to see it. Please release it. And so they finished it. And that's why at the end, when you see the dedication, it says for Brandon and Eliza. That's why. Because it was for Brandon, obviously, but also because Eliza, she was there. She was with him every day. They were getting married 3 weeks later, and her life almost ended on that day. And she's still like, go back and finish this for Brandon. He would want this. This is part of the reason why I said earlier this film is held in such, mythical cult, classic, is because of, we know the tragedy around it. But imagine how much we still, to this day, 30 years later, we still talk about Brandon Lee because of The Crow. I'm not saying what he did before this wasn't good. I've seen some of Brandon Lee's other work. He was a good action actor. I enjoy him. But this was such a classic. And it's crazy to me. Like, there's a world where this film doesn't exist, if not for his mother and his fiance saying, please do this for Brandon. So that's my MVP.
That makes a lot of sense, because I think what they saw was they saw him at his best. They saw what he did, and they were like, it'd be insane if no one gets to see what he got to do, because this, like I was talking about the Kurt Cobain thing earlier, like this was his best thing he'd ever done. If it hadn't ever come out, would we even be talking about Brandon Lee 30 years later? I don't know that we would. Not, and it's there's something like slightly morbid about the idea. It's like, well, he died making this movie that's super fucking cool, but he died, and they didn't want him to die in complete vain, because they saw what he did. They were like, this was his dream. His dream was to be a movie star, and this was his movie star moment, and it happened. It worked. It totally worked. They didn't want to take that away from his legacy, and he got to be a legend all on his own. There are people now who know Brandon Lee and barely even understand who Bruce Lee is because of The Crow. You and I, obviously, Bruce Lee's like, we knew Bruce Lee before I knew Brandon Lee even existed. I only know Brandon Lee existed because of The Crow. And there are people who only know Brandon Lee existed and are not quite sure who his dad ever was. That made Brandon Lee a legend. So it's totally legit to say MVP, because those two women were looking out for this guy. They said this was his dream, and you could shut it down, and we're not going to force you to finish this movie, but it was his dream, and damn it, he did it. So we want people to see it. Otherwise, he'll die, and no one will ever have seen what he achieved. We want to show you what he achieved. So solid pick.
And while I love Bruce Lee, I grew up on Bruce Lee, martial arts guy, I love Bruce Lee. Brandon Lee is my Bruce Lee, because this was such a formative movie for me. Like, to me, I hold Brandon Lee in the same regard that a lot of people hold Bruce Lee, because Bruce Lee was still before our time. Like,
I never grew up with him. I didn't know him. Yeah, he was dead before I was around.
He's a legend. Of course he's a legend. I've seen all his movies. I love the martial arts movies, but Brandon Lee was of my era, and this happened when I was a kid, when I was a teenager. So yeah, like, Brandon Lee is, like, for all the people who grew up in the 70s idolizing Bruce Lee, I grew up in the 90s idolizing Brandon Lee after this. So, yeah. So, if not for his wife, his fiance and his mother pleading with them to finish this never happened. So, that's why they get my MVP. Now, Patrick, our next category is a solo category. I'm not participating in this particular category.
Speaking of Brandon Lee.
Yeah, speaking of Brandon Lee, there is another category we were going to do right here, and that would be our famous
testicle.
Patrick, this is all you, my friend. Step right into the deep end.
I'm going to be fair here. Okay, yes, I love any time we get to break out the One Testicle Award. For a movie from the early 90s, any one of the people in this movie could have won the One Testicle Award. Any one of them. I wanted to include Brandon Lee in here somewhere. Listen, I'm giving Brandon Lee the One Testicle Award because, listen, there were some pretty one testicle moments in this movie. By the way, One Testicle Award, the great Nicolas Cage, gave us the One Testicle Award. He was at one of his peaks in the early 90s, too. He was Nicolas Cage in 1994. It was a big fucking deal. So I think it's very apropos because the 90s birthed sort of this weird operatic acting style that Brandon Lee embraced for the role. And this role, to me, as the Crow, and I could justify it like as a character choice, but it's a choice, and it's a one testicle choice, where his mannerisms could go way over the top at times. I mean, big, real big, Damon. The kind of big that was like old Hollywood big. And I truly believe it was a choice by Brandon Lee. But I was like, listen, I could give One Testicle Awards to Tintin. I could give One Testicle Awards to Top Dollar. I'm giving it to Brandon Lee because this was his moment. This was his moment in the sun. And if anybody was given one testicle, he had to give it two testicles, Damon. How about that?
I'll say this. We kind of joke the One Testicle Award is like our overacting award is what we say that, but it could also be a compliment. And because we name it after Nicolas Cage or Prisoners of Ghostland, because when he went full Nicolas Cage and said one testicle as we play the clip there, we're not insulting it. This is not like taking a shot at anybody. It's somebody who's just going for it. And I'll argue, and I think you'll probably agree with me, this film isn't the film it is if Brandon doesn't go over the top in some of those moments. Because if he's just like dark and dour and all goth and just being like, he delivers every line he delivers in just a very, you know, almost a milk toast way, it doesn't have the same impact. It's the delicious way he delivers that you remember those lines, you remember those moments. Like when he's staring down Fun Boy and he goes, Jesus Christ. He goes, Jesus Christ walked into it, but he tells the joke as he's shooting him with the gun. You don't get those moments if Brandon Lee isn't a little over the top. So while it sounds like this is a, you know, kind of a joking award, it's not. It can be. Don't get me wrong. But I think that, you know, you don't really get here without Brandon being Brandon in this moment.
I was fully expecting a brooding, like monotone, like almost Rambo-esque, like performance. I didn't know it was going to go all over the place. The first time fucking seeing this movie, it's fucking full one testicle, Damon. And that's not an insult. That is a tribute to the 90s. The 90s is full of performances like this. I just wanted to make sure that Brandon Lee got an award. And damn it, I was going to pull the one testicle award regardless. So I might as well have given it to the man himself.
Hey, I would argue, and I mentioned Die Hard earlier with Alan Rickman's character in that movie. I would argue Hans Gruber is an all-time great villain. I would argue, you know, even in that movie, Bruce Willis, when he says, "Welcome to the party, pal," that's full one testicle. That's all one testicle.
Mel Gibson in Lethal Weapon, one testicle. I mean, it's all over the place. It's in so many movies. It's so many movies we love come from the era of like one testicle. I mean, that's the whole reason this award exists, is for giving it all you got.
One of my all-time favorite action movies that they just remade, and it was awful, was Roadhouse. Patrick Swayze was full one testicle that entire movie, and I loved every minute of it. Jake Gyllenhaal, please stop. Don't do a sequel. Just stop right now. It was terrible.
It's coming out. You know, there's a Roadhouse sequel coming.
I know there is. I know. But yeah, you're right. Like that night, that like you don't. But again, Lethal Weapon's not Lethal Weapon without Mel Gibson being in that role. John McClane is not John McClane without Bruce Willis. So yeah, you're right. Like you don't get this performance unless Brandon Lee goes fucking full on. So to that point, I have some polls for best line. Now, again, this is one of my top 3 films of all time, so I pulled like 6 lines here. So I'm just going to go through them real quick here so we don't waste a whole lot of time. I'm going to start off with a couple of Brandon Lee lines from earlier in the film, my 2 favorite Brandon Lee lines. First off is when he is with poor old Tintin.
Victims, aren't we all?
That might be one of the most famous lines from this movie, Victims, aren't we all? It's on like a Million Crow t-shirts, so that's very, very famous. Now, this one is when Eric Draven is talking to Gideon in the pawn shop, which that's one of my favorite scenes of the whole film, because Gideon, even when he's getting his ass kicked, he's still rebellious, which I love, all the way up to the end when he's talking shit to Top Dollar. He's still doing it.
I'm not going to kill you. Your job will be to tell the rest of them that death is coming for them tonight. Tell them Eric Draven sends his regards.
I don't. If you grew up, you watched Game of Thrones. The Lannisters send their regards.
Oh yes.
You know, Eric Draven sends his regards. I love that. Yes. And also, by the way, you talk about the camera work. How much did you love dumping the engagement rings into the shotgun, and then you see the blowout with the rings?
Oh yeah,
that was such a great shot.
So dramatic.
Yeah. Now, my actual favorite, I do actually have one favorite line from this movie. I'll play that in a second. So Top Dollar delivers 2 incredible lines in this movie. Here's Top Dollar at his absolute best in this movie.
No, I want you to set a fire so goddamn big the gods will notice us again. That's what I'm saying.
I want all of you boys to be able to look me straight in the eye one more time and say, "Are we having fun or what?" Hey, you! Huh? What's your name? Skank? You don't feel that?
I feel like a little worm on a big fucking hook.
I feel like a little worm on a big fucking hook. Well, boy, your mama must be damn proud of you.
And then just for posterity's sake, I got to play it again.
Quick impression for you.
Caw, bang, fuck, I'm dead.
Now, I do have an actual favorite line from The Crow, and this is one that I've contemplated getting tattooed on me. This is one that I actually went out after this movie and bought Paradise Lost by John Milton, because this is the line it's from. But this is T-Bird's death scene when he finally figures out it's Eric Draven.
I know you. I knew you. I knew you. But you ain't you. You can't be you. We put you through the window. There ain't no coming back. This is the really real world. There ain't no coming back. We killed your dad. There ain't no coming back. There ain't no coming back. There ain't no coming back. Abash the devil stood and felt how awful goodness is. And felt how awful goodness is.
That line, which they say earlier when they attack Shelley and Eric, when he says, "Abash the devil stood and felt how awful goodness is." It's a line from Paradise Lost by John Milton. Just that, the way he delivers that with just pure, terrified fear in his face when he realizes what's happening to him, and he says, "Abash the devil stood and felt how awful goodness is." I just love that delivery. That's my actual favorite line from this movie.
Every one of those lines could easily be a One Testicle Award line, and for all the right reasons, like truly. And side note, give your bad guys more poetry and prose to recite. Like it's sorely missing from bad guys today. I'm going to give a quick diversion. We talked about Fast and the Furious earlier. Did you see the most recent one with Jason Momoa? Or you don't really watch those movies?
No, I do. I watched.
Oh, you did?
I've seen all of them. Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay. Jason Momoa is channeling the early 90s One Testicle performance, and it's glorious. It is the exact injection that a stale franchise like Fast and Furious needed. It was just a bunch of car explosions and a bunch of tough guys, and he said, "No, I'm going to be so over the top and so weird and say weird shit and do weird shit and dance and twirl and put my hair up and paint my nails. I'm going to be a psycho 90s crazy villain." All those lines that you just put out there with all those villains and even the Crow himself, like, bring back the over-the-top villain. It's a fantastic thing. It really is. I want to be able to give One Testicle Awards all summer long for all the summer blockbuster movies, because it's fun to watch villains go off the rails like this.
If I actually pulled all my favorite quotes, the entire podcast would me just be like laughing and naming quotes from this movie, because this is honestly one of the most, like, along with maybe Pulp Fiction, maybe my most quotable movie, because there's so many great quotable lines, funny lines. You know, just like, even again, I mentioned earlier when Gideon goes, "I'm not twisted like you two sick fucks." Like, there's just so many great lines in this movie. That was just a few of them, but yes, this is just, and that was the dialogue. How many times you probably quote Die Hard from start to finish, because that's just got great lines in it throughout. Who doesn't know?
Love quote.
Shoot the glass. Like, who doesn't know that? Like,
I mean, yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker, is like, it's just in the vernacular now.
Exactly. All right, let's move on to Best Costume. I love this award because this is fashion-wise, Patrick, let's be honest. I'm still trying to figure out how I could be more like the Crow.
Damon, this is exactly why I put this category in. I watched this movie, and this is what's insane, is like, I watched this movie and I went, yeah, I would have been full blown goth because I would have had to emulate this movie. The way these guys dress is so cool, and the women in this movie, they dress super. Bai Ling is fucking full blown Bai Ling. Like, I don't know if some people might not be familiar with her. She's a personality, right? And it doesn't even feel like she's acting in this movie. So everybody across the board is just the style that like you said earlier, I've been craving my entire life, and I've been too much of a coward to fully embrace. So I said, I'm going for best costume in this one because I loved everybody's look in this movie. And my best costume goes to Tintin, one of the thugs. And by the way, played by, oh gosh, where I had him here. Where is he? Played by, what's his name? I want to give a shout out to him, Lawrence Mason, who plays Tintin. I loved he was also cool as ice in Hackers. He was the hacker I wanted to be in Hackers too. And in this, he's sort of like a knife expert, but of course he's clad in leather. He's got, it doesn't even make sense. There's so many layers to the outfits. It's like there's a trench coat, there's a vest, there's a holsters. He's got all these knives. He's got cool boots on. Like, that's the guy of all the people in this movie that I would go walking around dressed like.
I mean, you got to remember, the Crow got his look from Tintin. He took his coat. He had the big long leather trench coat that was taken from Tintin. That now makes like every iconic photo you ever see of the Crow.
Yeah, the silhouette of the Crow is that trench coat, and the trench coat comes from Tintin.
He was so cool, and the knives and everything, and again, the character was awesome, but the dress was, I mean, the leather coat on top of the leather vest with no shirt, by the way, no shirt underneath the leather vest, just a leather vest, and he had the gloves on, like the weightlifter gloves on.
Yeah, fingerless leather gloves. Like, it's a whole look, dude. It's so fucking cool.
As you said, that's the kind of look that, like, I look at and I'm like, I could never do that, but fuck, that's cool. Like, I know I could never pull that off, but God, that's cool. You can pull that off, Patrick. I think you could pull it off.
I would, but also it takes a lot of work, and I live in a hot town. Like, wearing a leather trench coat is just it's not practical here. But yeah, I'm slowly, Damon, like, fully accepting my gothness. Like, more and more, like, I wear just more. I'm like, I want to wear black, and I've always wanted to wear black since I was a young child. And I'm like, why do I even have blue jeans? I threw them out. I was like, I don't want to wear these. Like, I want to wear black. I want to look like people from this movie.
Yeah, it's so great. So mine, I could have easily gone with just the Crow, because the Crow is goth. I mean, that is goth style. Although I will say he wears spandex, and that's something a big guy like myself should never, ever, ever wear. You should never wear spandex unless you're really slender or you're incredibly muscular. Doesn't look good on anything else. I'm sorry to tell you that.
I'm not wearing spandex either.
Yeah, the combat boots and the black and just the trench coat, it's just iconic.
Yeah, the wet hair over the face, the Sting makeup, it's fucking rad.
And while you have, and by the way, Sting copied that off Crow.
Yes, of course.
But you have the hair to go with it. I tried once to grow my hair out. It was a bad idea. So I can't do the Crow. I just can't. Now, to be fair, I can't do my favorite costume either, but I just fucking love it. It sounds like, as much as I love this movie, this is me just full on filleting Top Dollar this entire movie. But I love the way he dresses in this movie. As I said, he made the Seinfeld puffy shirt look fucking cool. Yeah. The leather gloves, the tight vest, and the long, just as you said, like flat ironed hair down, the voice, the pants. He looks like a swashbuckling fucking buccaneer from like the 1700s. Yet he is like the most devilish villain of the 90s. And I just love the way he dresses. And he makes outfits that should not look cool. And I love that about him.
I have to wonder if somebody on the Seinfeld writing staff hadn't seen The Crow and then wrote that into the Seinfeld. I don't remember where that episode lays in the timeline, but it's got to be close. It's got to be very close. Like somewhere in there where it's like, look at this fucking guy in this movie, The Crow. He's wearing a pirate outfit, but he looks cool as shit. Like he really does. Like even today, it did. I wasn't like, oh wow, look how ridiculous of a bad guy that is. It's like, no, look how fucking cool that guy looks. And it's just like he owns it. He owns the look, and you have to admire it. You have to aspire to owning the look so well, because it just. He really, and of course, his weapon of choice is a sword, because he's a goddamn privateer from the 1820s.
It's a swashbuckling sword. It's got like the big handle on it from like the swashbuckling. It's an actual fucking pirate sword.
Yeah, he's a fucking pirate. He's like, I'm a bad guy. I do mountains of coke, and I steal real estate, and I want to dress like a pirate. Okay, like no one's gonna say boo about that.
And I'm not saying this is a good idea. I'm certainly not advocating for anyone to go out and do a pile of cocaine, but every movie you've ever seen in pretty much history, beside maybe Scarface, where he had the cool double nostril thing, which everyone remembers that from Scarface. Every movie you've ever seen with cocaine is someone using basically a credit card to cut the lines, and then they use a dollar bill to snort it. He uses a straight razor, which is just like, again, I'm not saying it's cool you should do coke. I'm not saying you should do coke. But the way he uses a straight razor to cut his lines, I was like, that's just fucking cool. Like, that's just him. He's like the coolest motherfucker.
The whole point of this category was like, everything in this movie is so over the top cool. Like it just down to details like that, where it's like, yeah, let's give him like an old barber straight razor to cut his coke with. And you're like, because it looks fucking cool. Not because it's practical, not because it makes sense, because it's fucking cool. And that's why I had this category.
I love it. I love it. All right, let's talk about best kill, because as we said, this was not a movie you typically would make in the 90s as far as like how violent and brutal it is. And again, really, they're not even making this today. Like, while they do make, like, they're about to come out with an R-rated Marvel film with Deadpool and Wolverine, and they have made Deadpool in a couple other R-rated films, that still, story-wise, doesn't go nearly as far as this one does. So this had some pretty brutal kills in it. So, Patrick, what was your favorite kill in The Crow?
Did I steal your best kill?
No, you didn't actually.
Oh,
So
okay. Okay, interesting. Yeah, because
it's the one time I didn't pick him.
Yeah, I was going to say, because as history has shown, Top Dollar is all about, Damon is all about Top Dollar, and I picked Top Dollar's kill because I was enjoying every kill that was coming around because they're all thematically relevant. Like I say, in any good slasher, the person getting slashed, like there's something about their personality that is injected into their slash. And that is very much how The Crow goes. Like the Crow kills people the way that they live their lives, or the way that they've harmed others. He harms them back. Like it's a very specific way he kills. But Top Dollar's kill, which is my pick, was so dramatically awesome. They're having this fight at the top of the fucking building. By the way, the more I'm talking about this movie, the more it feels like a ripoff of Batman '89. Like so much of it goes that way with the Joker and Batman. But also, in the way Top Dollar dies is he falls over the side after a very dramatic battle, and he gets impaled on a gargoyle statue. And the blood is dripping down, and it looks so fucking gnarly. Like it's a really gnarly kill. And I was just like, yeah, I loved all the other kills, but that's the fucking coolest one.
Now that is an awesome kill, but you didn't even mention my favorite part about that kill.
Do tell.
Earlier in the movie, when the Crow shows up at Officer Albrecht's house, and he touches Officer Albrecht and he sees Shelley. Yeah. And he says, you stayed with her the whole time. And he says, I thought maybe she'd wake up and he knew he cared. He cared. He legitimately cared. He was there with Shelley the whole way from the hospital until the moment she died. And he absorbed all that. As we always say, if you're going to show us something, use it. And after it looks like Top Dollar's gotten the best of the Crow, he says, I have something for you. And he grabs him by the face. He says, 30 hours of pain all at once. And it's just his face like blood and shoot. I loved that injection of he's just like, I have something for you. I don't need it anymore. 30 hours of pain all at once, and grabs Top Dollar's face and injects all the pain and misery of Shelley into Top Dollar. I fucking loved that scene because it wasn't, they had a cool sword fight and it's a cool battle, but that little twist of him being like, here, you can have back what you did to us. I just loved that 30 hours of pain all at once. I was like, oh, fuck yeah.
It was a great dramatic payoff for all of that stuff. Yeah, it was the perfect way to foil him because Top Dollar was getting the best of him. Truth, they got his Crow and they stole his power. So to be able to just transfer the pain over to Top Dollar is the only way to defeat him, and then send him careening over the side of a building and get impaled by a gargoyle. I mean, drama, Damon. Go higher the whole way. I loved it.
Yeah, so my favorite kill actually goes back to my first favorite line, which is the victims aren't we all, is the fight with Tintin. Because at that point, you don't really know what the Crow is exactly. Like, you see the scene where he relives his death, where he jumps out the window and swings back in. You see the cuts on his hand, they heal. So you understand there's something supernatural going on here. But you still don't fully know who the Crow is in this moment. And then when Tintin goes in that alley and he lights a cigarette in the dumpster fire and he falls off the thing and he laughs, he has that maniacal like he's like, what y'all painted up for, crackhead? And like they start fighting, and it again, it's not a one beat fight where it's just the Crow kicking his ass. Like again, Tintin gets the upper hand momentarily where he says, some dude, some bitch, what of it? And he insults it, and he gets the better of the Crow for a minute. And then he says, murder, it's easy. And he throws the knives at him, and this is a guy who does not, I got two little friends. They never miss. And he chucks him at him. He swipes the one away, swipes the other away, and he goes, try harder. And then he finally catches it. He throws it back, chucks him in the elbow, and then or chucks it in the shoulder, and then attacks him. He pulls out the knife. He says, victims, aren't we all? And he stabs him. That is so fucking cool. It's such a cool fight scene. But then afterwards, when they showed the aftermath, and you see all the knives sticking out of Tintin, and Officer Albrecht says, yeah, he stuck a knife in each one of his organs in alphabetical order. It's just like, that's just a cool death scene. That whole fight scene of Tintin being like, I never lose. And then he just gets fucking stabbed with his own knives. I just love that.
Yeah, that was actually my runner-up. Like, I was like, it's going to be between these two. Which is it going to be? But it's a fantastic kind of intro to who the Crow is, and an intro to how tough these bad guys can be, because Tintin does not go out without a serious fight. And I love that scene where they're rolling his body away with all the knives sticking out.
And I also love when the asshole detective is like, and what do you call that? And he said, I call it blood, detective. And he goes, but you'll probably write it up as graffiti. with the crow sign in blood.
Written in blood, yeah.
And he goes, what do you call that? And he's like, it's blood, detective, but you'll probably write it up as graffiti.
Very one testicle movie, but really in the best way possible.
So many lines, man. It's like the dialogue. Like, I don't know. I know there's multiple writers on this. I don't know who, like, I'm sure everyone who wrote on this had some hand in the dialogue, but kudos, man. The dialogue in this movie is just utterly delicious.
Yeah, it's very almost like noir, or like a serial pulp from like the 50s or something like that. There's that heightened kind of sense of drama in the dialogue.
Last category, Patrick, and this is a weird one because The Crow does teeter the line between sci-fi, comic, and a bit of horror. And is it scary? And I'll be honest, and I think you'll agree with me, this isn't meant to be a scary movie. Now, is it horrific, though? And I think that's where this film succeeds and where it crosses over into that horror realm, because the atrocities that are carried out on Eric and Shelley and then leading into the straight up murder of the villains. You know, we talk about literally stabbing this guy 1,000 times. I mean, Fun Boy getting stabbed to death with his heroin needles. That's pretty brutal. You know, that whole thing. And even the moment when he goes in and finds Sarah's mother and he says, mother is the name of God on the lips and hearts of children. And he twists her arm and the morphine comes pouring out of her. That's pretty freaking gross. So while this is not a straight up horror movie, this is a horrific movie. And I think that's where it kind of caters into the horror side of things. So no, it's not scary. It's not meant to be scary, but there is a horror element here that you just won't get in a regular comic book movie or even a revenge movie like this.
I'm going to compare this to my favorite Nightmare on Elm Street film, Dream Master. The horrors that are carried out just happen to be from the perspective of the good guy this time. Whereas in Dream Master, it's the bad guy committing horrors against the good people in thematic ways. This is flipped around, where it's the good guys committing horrors on the bad guys the way that they were committing horrors on the world. And so many times I thought of Dream Master. That's a major compliment for me, Damon, because Dream Master is my Nightmare on Elm Street film. That's my favorite one. That's the number one for me. And I saw the parallels right there. So right away, I was comparing it to one of my top horror films. So yeah, and in that respect, is it a scary movie? It's not a scary movie. It's not even remotely a scary movie. It's an action movie. It's a revenge thriller. And it's a goth supernatural fucking mashup that's fucking super cool. And it has these elements that are from the horror realm. I mean, try to find a horror fan that doesn't even at least know The Crow and know what it's all about. Most of them are rabid fans anyway. So this absolutely belongs with the horror community. So is it scary? No. But does it belong with horror? Yes.
And this, to me, has the greatest soundtrack in film history. I love this soundtrack, from The Cure to Nine Inch Nails to Rage Against the Machine to Pantera to everything in between. This movie has the greatest. Stone Temple Pilots, this movie has the single greatest soundtrack of all time. Like I said, I stood in line for 4 hours on Record Store Day to buy it on vinyl. It is now out there everywhere on vinyl, but I adored this soundtrack. The score by Graham Revell is also incredible. Graham Revell's done a million scores. Great score, everything about this. And I didn't even mention, I got to throw this out there for our YouTube fans. If you don't watch this on YouTube, You should be on YouTube. Go search us out, Rewind of the Living Dead. But one of my favorite little tweaks in this movie that I absolutely love that goes into a death scene is after Eric Draven duct tapes T-Bird to his car and sets it off, and you see him peeling out. I love the silhouette of the car peeling away, and you see Eric Draven go. He does a little bye-bye. So do you remember that? Did you catch that?
Yeah.
He does a little bye-bye. It's just hilarious with two fingers. He just goes bye-bye, and then he flies off and the car explodes. And just, again, this is, to me, as I said, this to me is basically a perfect movie on a lot of regards. And I'm glad you enjoyed it. I was going to be a little brokenhearted if you came and you're like, I hated this movie. This was terrible.
No.
And also because it's a goth movie, it kind of has to be horror. Like every goth movie has to be kind of horror. Like even Heathers is a bit of a goth movie, and it's not really a goth movie, but it's got that kind of gothic overtone to it. And JD's character and Christian Slater and Beetlejuice, not really a horror movie, not really at all. It's a comedy more than anything, but it's got that goth. It's got Lydia. She's the goth character, so of course it kind of leans over into horror. So yeah, this has to be horror by definition.
Absolutely.
All right, folks, that is our episode. As I mentioned, The Crow, we're not getting paid to say this, and this was all done as a 30th anniversary celebration, but Wednesday and Thursday, May 29th and May 30th, they are re-releasing The Crow into theaters for 2 nights only. Go see it if you want to. Go see it in the theater. I can tell you it's a magical experience. As a guy who actually was there in 1994, it did, and it has lived with me forever. But if you are a fan of this film, I would highly recommend seeing it in the theaters. Or, as I mentioned, it is available on 4K as well. And it was so cool to see that transfer, just the updated version of it in 4K. And it also has some cool special features, documentaries, things like that. The Crow celebrates 30 years. And later this year, we will review the Crow remake, and we'll find out how that stacks up compared to this one. As always, want to say a big thank you to everyone that tunes in. Make sure you check us out on all your favorite podcast platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and as I mentioned earlier, over on our YouTube channel. You got questions, comments, movies you'd like us to review, hit us up on email anytime, rotlivingdead@gmail.com. That is rot, livingdead@gmail.com, or find us on social media. Just search Rewind of the Living Dead on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. We get messages all the time. We love hearing from you guys, so please send us those messages over there. We'd love to hear from you. We always try to respond. And I will have a little bit of a surprise about another place you can find Rewind of the Living Dead in the very near future. Stay tuned for that announcement in the near future. And you can also find us on our own personal social media channels. You can find me at Damon Martin, and you are?
At Director Patrick.
And a big thank you, as always, for everyone that tunes into the show. We will be back next week with another edition of Rewind of the Living Dead. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you then.
Peace.